Yes, Attorney General, you've been asked some questions before the adjournment.
So, yes, I was asked various questions by Deputy Ozef and one by Deputy Scott. So, taking first Deputy Ozef's questions, the answer to his first question is yes. Any amending legislation to primary law would require a minister's certificate in accordance with Article 16 of the Human Rights Law, and the minister would receive human rights advice in order that him or her could give that certificate. So the second question was a more general question concerning ECHR issues and the Venice Commission. So my answer to that is, I think as members are already aware, that the Venice Commission does not have legal force. The relevant legal obligation for Jersey is Article 3 of Protocol 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is part of Jersey's domestic law. And in terms of the approach of the courts to that particular obligation, so there is a consistent approach of the courts, which is that states are given a wide margin of appreciation in terms of how they devise their electoral systems. There is no specific system that states must follow, but systems limitations must not impair the very essence of rights under Article 3 of Protocol 1 or deprive them of their effectiveness. And that goes back to a case of Matthew Mohin and Belgium back in 1987, but that looks to be still the current approach of the Strasbourg Court. So Deputy Ozef's third question was in two parts, and it was concerning judicial review and challenges. So he was asking whether there would be a judicial review challenge to any decisions this Assembly may make in response to this proposition, and my answer is no.
Clarification, so it wasn't in relation to this proposition.
Well, perhaps I can just finish my answers and then he can ask me supplemental questions. I understood it that would there be a judicial review challenge in relation to decisions on this proposition. My answer is no, there wouldn't, because this Assembly is acting as a legislature, not an executive, and it's acting in principle and not on specific legislation. And then the second part of his question was, would there be a challenge to the legislation itself, which may or may not be amended? And my answer to that is there could be a challenge seeking a declaration of incompatibility under Article 5 of the Human Rights Law. But my advice to members is that the challenge, if brought, would fail for the reasons that I've already outlined, the consistent approach of the courts to this particular obligation in the Human Rights Law, or the ECHR. And then lastly, sir, in relation to Deputy Scott's question, my answer to that is no. Deputy Miller's proposition to reintroduce senators is not contrary to human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney. Yes, Deputy Ozef.
Thank you, sir. I'm very grateful for the Attorney General's advice, sir. I just, for the point of record, I didn't ask about this proposition. It was about the legal
Well, I
issues.
did. It was one of the ones I listed to you. There was a question that arose from your speech. That's why it was answered by the attorney.
It was the legislation I'm concerned with, sir. And the Attorney General said, should there be a, so it's conditional, should there be an appeal, it would fail. And he says that, he explains, sir, that Article 5 would mean that there would be, in his opinion, a likely failure, but that's obviously not a ruling of our higher court. I'm called to mind a particular challenge recently of legislation which I think has been the subject of a Court of Appeal judgment, sir. So he's saying, I just want to make sure I've got this right. He's not making a ruling, or can't, but it would fail in his opinion, but there has been challenges, has there not, of this Assembly's ability to legislate?
Mr. Attorney, do you want to respond to that further question?
Yes, sir, briefly. Clearly, I am not a court, and this is my advice, but it is based on thorough research of Strasbourg case law. In terms of the Deputy's recent reference to a recent case, yes, there was a declaration of incompatibility in relation to legislation associated with a tax information exchange case and the way in which that legislation sought to confer limitations on liabilities to pay costs. And yes, the Court of Appeal did declare that legislation to be incompatible. But sir, 3 weeks ago, I appeared in the Privy Council where we were appealing that particular decision, and the decision of the Privy Council is awaited.
Yes, Deputy Taddeo, another question for the attorney?
I do, sir. The question, again, relating to Article 3 is about whether or not it is even theoretically possible for a court, either in the initial phase or on appeal, to uphold or to judge that there has been an unfair election in terms of both the distribution of seats and or the voting system, on the basis that actually it talks not just about free expression, but about free expression of the opinion of the people. So if I were to give an example, sir, to put to the Attorney General, if there was a scenario, for example, whereby a system were devised where there were constituencies, for example, where there was only one person that could vote, and they would have, say, 10 seats, and there was another constituency where there were 1,000 people who could vote for 10 people. At what point would would Article 3, if ever, be triggered? Or in other words, how egregious could an electoral voting system be in terms of inequality before it would invoke Article 3?
Attorney.
Sorry, it's Article 3 of Protocol 1 to the ECHR. And so the consistent approach of the courts is to look at all the circumstances of the case. And I'm not sure that I can do better than the answer I've already given, in that it must impair the very essence of the rights afforded by Article 3 of Protocol 1 or deprive them of their effectiveness. Now, clearly, it would be possible to come up with extreme situations where those rights would be deprived of their essence and deprived of their effectiveness. I approach it in relation to this particular proposition, and the advice that I give to members is no, it would not infringe Article 3 of Protocol 1.
Thank you. Constable St Martin.
Thank you, sir. Sorry. Thank you. PPC has considered the establishment of a Boundaries Commission, but concluded that it was not the right solution for Jersey in the current form prescribed by the State's decision in 2021. To provide some background, the rationale for the inclusion of a Boundaries Commission in the proposals, which saw major changes to the composition of this Assembly, was born of frustration. At that point, so many attempts to change the membership of the Assembly had failed, often because once something was lodged, there would then follow numerous random amendments by other members, which often distorted the carefully balanced proportions of the original. I think we can all recognise that scenario. The last Assembly's PPC proposed changes via P139/2020 to the island's constituencies, which sought to address long-standing inequities in representation and ensure each constituency met Venice Commission ratios, with the number of representatives reflecting the population levels. To guard against this system being negatively impacted in the future by haphazard amendments, it was proposed to create a Boundaries Commission, which would oversee the maintenance of the equilibrium achieved in terms of voter equity, and essentially shift responsibility for suggesting any further changes away from the Assembly, future changes away from the Assembly. In the UK, the Boundaries Commission's statutory function is to keep under review the distribution of constituencies, which sought to address long-standing inequities in representation and ensure each constituency met Venice Commission ratios, with the number of representatives reflecting the population levels. Oh, sorry, I've gone back on that one, sorry. Shall I start again? Because I've actually mixed up my speech.
Yes.
It's the way I do things.
The time limit normally, but
yeah, sorry.
45
It's
seconds
quite a complicated one, this one. Yeah, sorry. Right, I'll start again, which I haven't done before. PPC has considered the establishment of a Boundaries Commission, but concluded that it was not the right solution for Jersey in the current form prescribed by the state's decision in 2021. To provide some background, the rationale for the inclusion of the Boundaries Commission in the proposals, which saw major changes to the composition of this Assembly, was born of frustration. At that point, so many attempts to change the membership of the Assembly had failed, often because once something was lodged, there would then follow numerous random amendments by other members, which often distorted the carefully balanced proportions of the original. And I think we can all recognise that scenario. The last Assembly's PPC proposed changes via P139/2020 to the island's constituencies, which sought to address long-standing inequities in representation and ensure each constituency met Venice Commission ratios, with the number of representatives reflecting the population levels. To guard against this system being negatively impacted in the future by haphazard amendments, it was proposed to create a Boundaries Commission, which would oversee the maintenance of the equilibrium achieved in terms of voter equity, and essentially shift responsibility for suggesting any future changes away from the Assembly. In the UK, the Boundaries Commission's statutory function is to keep under review the distribution of constituencies in England and to make periodical reports, currently every 8 years, with recommendations to the Speaker of the House of Commons. During an active general review of the constituencies in England, the Commission allocates a defined number of constituencies to England, the precise number being calculated using a set formula and producing a figure broadly in proportion to the size of England's electorate, as against that of the whole United Kingdom. Each constituency is also required to have an electorate that is within 5% of the United Kingdom electoral quota. In the UK, the chair of the Commission is the Speaker of the House of Commons, but in practice it is the Deputy Chair who leads the review. The Deputy Chair must be a serving judge of the High Court and is supported by 2 other commissioners, whose appointments are made following an open public appointment selection process. The Commissioners are part-time appointees who meet whenever the work programme requires and are paid a daily fee set by the Treasury. The Director General of Ordnance Survey and the Statistics Authority serve as statutory assessors, technical advisors, to the Commission. During active constituency review, Assistant Commissioners are appointed. There are 18 appointed for the most recent review, also paid a day rate. And they chair the public hearings that the Commission is statutorily required to hold, assess the representations received, and make the recommendations to the Commissioners. PPC concluded that this system would be disproportionate for Jersey's needs. We have historical parish boundaries which no one would wish to alter and which P139/2020 respected. So any changes would most likely be to the number of representatives required in each constituency. P139/2020 provided quite specific detail on the composition of the Commission, including that the chair of the Commission and 3 of its 6 members should be from outside the island, but not a lot else. Indeed, as has been mentioned earlier, there is scant detail in the accompanying report as to how it would be structured, the scope of the Commission's remit, how it would be resourced, no mention of payment, and we may struggle to find suitable people willing to do this voluntarily. There is also no explanation provided as to why the majority of members should be external. Presumably, this was to guard against any perceptions of self-interest. It is for those reasons that PPC has not established a Boundaries Commission to date. But if this Assembly supports this amendment, then I would be asking my committee to consider bringing a rescindment of part of the previous state's decision which detailed the Commission's composition and will propose an alternative way forward. One option could be to mirror the process used to review and determine members' remuneration. A personal body could be recruited solely for this purpose every 4 years, after each election, or a review could be undertaken every 8 years, just like the UK, to review the constituencies and make recommendations for any changes to the number of representatives in each, which could then be implemented at the next election. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Untitled of St John.
Thank you, sir. I thought this was probably the easiest of the amendments, and I'm not sure why it takes so long, but I thought Deputy Reynolds' speech before lunch summed things very well, in my opinion. I also enjoyed Deputy Tadier's contribution, especially his description of the neck-and-neck race between option A and B in the referendum. Perhaps out of character for him, so he missed the opportunity to describe option C, the do-nothing option, as becoming option C, the sea of change. So I'm happy to support this amendment. I'd remind members that the proposal is asking for analysis and for the findings to be brought to the Assembly. Importantly, the proposal doesn't bind this Assembly to adopt the findings of any such review. This morning, members voted a sizable majority to retain constables with all the nuances we have in terms of our numbers. And with this in mind, the distribution of all other members, as is the case now, needs to be as even as practical. So I'd like to thank Deputy Curtis for his brief but descriptive analysis that he shared with us earlier. That analysis gives me, and hopefully the majority of members, enough concern that we do need to take a closer look at the distribution of deputies should the main proposal be adopted, and that an independent body would be best placed to do this. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conrad. Does any other member speak on the amendment? Yes, Deputy Miller.
Sorry, sir. I've got the cough. Sorry. Thank you, sir. The chair of PPC has explained very well why we don't currently have a Boundaries Commission. I accept that a commission would may assist in debates around equity. I'll return to that subject. In our system, where we do have and have always had different categories of states member, debates regarding equity are usually not simple, especially as the calculations of equity are based on an overlapping of different political offices and associated constituencies that we have here. And so in some respects, we're no different from other jurisdictions where people vote for a National Assembly and for local councillors. So the constables, one could easily exclude those as being the local council and the rest of us as being the National Assembly, but we all sit together. And that does make things more complicated. I have so far been avoiding using the term gerrymandering because I do think it denotes improper motive and possibly dishonesty, but seeing as everybody else is happy to use it, I think one could say that the figures in Deputy Mezek's amendment, as supported by Deputy Taddy in his speech, are also gerrymandered. It's stated, for example, that the district of St John's, St Lawrence and Trinity has 7 representatives, and that may be true at a district level. But of course, it is not true for the individual voters in the district, who have 5 representatives. There are 4 deputies in the district and 1 constable, with each constable representing a parish with a different population within that district. I imagine, although I'm sure they would speak for themselves, that if the Constable of Trinity or the Constable of St Lawrence were approached by Deputy Tadei as a constituent of St John, they would tell him to go and speak to the Constable in St John and possibly not be able to assist because they are in a different parish and are elected to represent electors in that parish. The same principle applies in St Mary, St Juan and Peter, which actually have 4 representatives that people can vote for, and in Greuvel and St Martin, where they can have 3 deputies for whom they can vote. I accept that my proposition may have been incorrect in maintaining the existing level of equity by removing 1 deputy from each district and substituting 9 senators elected island-wide, and I clearly would want to correct the record on that. However, my proposition seeks to maintain the current districts with the current deputy system. And we have to remember that that itself is not popular. It is not necessarily popular in districts like St John, St Lawrence and St Mary, Trinity, nor in St Juan, St Peter and St Mary. During the public meeting, it was very clear that there were parishioners in St Mary who are very upset that they do not have a deputy living in that parish. And I have no doubt in my own district that had we ended up with 2 deputies in Trinity, 2 in St Lawrence and none in St John parishioners would have been very, very upset. People are very tied to the historic position of the parish and what that means for their representation. Deputy Curtis has given us a very detailed mathematical breakdown, and Deputy Alves said that her and her team also appear to have approached it largely the subject of districts as a mathematical question. But it's not a mathematical question. They have not won. The current arrangements may be mathematically sound. They may be sound from a position of electoral theory, but from the position of what the public see, they do not like them. They have not won hearts and minds, and we have to win hearts and minds. An independent boundaries commission, we have had the suggestion this morning that it could be established with people who live in Jersey. Absolutely no, of course it cannot, because how can it be independent if the people on that commission live here? We would have to have people from off the island, and we'd have to have people who understand how you set boundaries, and it will take time. And we would have to bring in people from the outside, and as I've said, we don't like, the public do not like people from the outside coming in and telling us how to do things. And again, it will create delay. I have been very clear that the structure of my proposition is simple and it's easy to, it will be simple and it will be easy to introduce. The law drafting will not be significant. I'm not going to address all Deputy Joseph's comments now because I think they sit with the PBC amendment and not with this. But this will, if this proposition is adopted, it will create delay and it will ultimately wreck this proposition even if it's accepted, if it's successful. We know that Jersey's electoral system has never been perfect in terms of equity, in terms of equal voting rights and equal voting power. That is a historic position, and much of what we do now has tried to, some of the current arrangements try to amend that. But I stand by my proposition to reintroduce senators, the most equitable office that can be, as a way of giving each voter a greater number of votes and the ability to exercise greater influence over who holds political roles in the island. For example, I think Deputy Curtis, I think, looked at the distribution of deputies. No? If we just look at what the public sees, at the moment, people can vote for either for between 3, 4 and 5 deputies and a constable. We'll leave the constable out of the equation. That means that some people see that they have 60% fewer votes than others. By introducing senators, members of the public, under my proposition, will be able to vote for between 12 to 14 members of this Assembly. That's a disparity of 86%, which is significantly better than the 60% disparity that they see now. And I understand the electoral theory, I understand population references, but the public see that where they live, they can only vote for 3 people, other people can vote, other voters and residents of the island can vote for 4 deputies or 5 deputies. And as far as the public's concerned, that has not won hearts and minds. And they do want to see senators back. And while Deputy Taddy may have objected to my use of the term jurisdiction, I believe I have been consistent in my opening speech in talking about the public and what the public want. Given that a previous Assembly has already approved a proposition to establish a commission, if PPC consider it necessary, and although it hasn't been acted on, it doesn't need another proposition to provide the authority to do so. I ask members to reject the amendment and leave any efforts towards greater electoral reform, including a boundary commission properly established with clear terms of reference and a focused objective for the next term, if that's what the future Assembly wishes to do. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member speak on this second amendment? I call upon Deputy Mesic to reply.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to all members who took part in this debate. I am sorely tempted to simply stand here and say I refer members to the speech of Deputy Alex Curtis and then sit down, but of course that would be much less fun, so I won't do that. But it does have to be said, sir, that I thought his speech was excellent, really made the point, and it was evidence-based as well. He was referring to the numbers, the formula, the calculations that determine people's voting weight. It was notable, sir, that in the speech from Deputy Miller just now, she didn't cite any real numbers at all. She referred to what are misconceptions of the public about their influence in voting systems based on the number of votes they have, not the weight of those votes. So you can have a constituency where there are 100 people living in it and everybody gets 1 vote, next to a constituency where there are 1,000 people living and everybody gets 1 vote. Are they equal? Do they have equal voting power? No, of course they don't, because it's not about the number of votes you have, it's about the weight of those votes and what impact they have on delivering the final results, sir. She explained about the complexities that come when you have overlapping constituencies, which is what we have by having parishes and districts that are based on either parishes or Vantains. Describes that as complicating these calculations. And that's exactly why we need people who know what they're talking about to be the ones to tell us what impact this actually has. And Deputy Miller, frequently talked about the system not being popular, and she referred to her public meetings. But sir, the fact remains, and we need to stop ignoring evidence just because it's inconvenient for us, sir, that in the district of St John, St Lawrence and Trinity, in the 2013 referendum, 75% of people who voted to scrap senators and voted for basically the system that we have now. That's evidence that we shouldn't just be ignoring because it's inconvenient for us. So I'll try to address specific comments that were made by different members, because some asked me to address particular points when I summed up, sir. Deputy Gardner asked me to clarify why I haven't, in the wording of the proposition, specifically stated how that Boundaries Commission ought to be formed. And the reason for that, to be blunt, is that if PPC can come up with a more efficient way of delivering it, I wouldn't want to stop them. I'd want them to go for that. The chair of PPC explained the UK Boundaries Commission system, which would obviously be ridiculous to copy and paste and try to apply to Jersey. And she referred to a potential rescindment of the previous motion and the prescriptions that that had offered. I completely support that because there is a common sense way forward here, which is to use the bodies that we've already got. Deputy Owls referred to scrapping the Referendum Commission and building it into the Jersey Electoral Authority. Obviously a good idea because we've had that body now for, 10 years, and what's it actually done? Literally nothing, but we've still had to expend energy on finding people to serve on it for them to end up doing nothing. So that's why, because I think it's better for PPC to have the ability to do that in the most efficient way possible, and they can do that, and I'm sure they'll want to do it in the most efficient way possible. Deputy Balash spoke, and it was worth listening to him because this is somebody who has kind of first-hand experience at this. In fact, I should say Deputy Renouf has first-hand experience of this as well, because both of them served on the Electoral Commission in 2012. That was an electoral commission, but in reality it was also a boundaries commission because it did look at options for boundaries and it proposed boundaries as part of its recommendations. As well as recommendations, that Commission also produced principles which it put in its reports, and they make a huge amount of sense. And just to pick two of the principles that that Commission arrived at, they said that constituencies should, as far as possible, be of equal size. Absolutely right, because that understands the importance of voter equity. And they said the electoral system should be simple, fair, and easy to understand. Again, absolutely right, because you don't get greater participation by making the systems overly complicated. So it's obvious why they arrived at those sensible conclusions, having undertaken what was at that time the greatest exercise of democratic consultation on this subject that there had ever been. But Deputy Balash said, even though he spoke in some senses sympathetically towards what I'm trying to do here, he did express some misgivings, which I hope that I can turn him around on. He's wanted to know what the point of this proposition was when there is already a standing states decision to create a boundaries commission. So, is my proposition relevant when an existing states decision already stands? Well, the reason, sir, that it is relevant is to be found in part 3 of the amendment, where I'm asking the states not simply to reiterate its existing agreement to create a boundaries commission, but very specifically to ask PPC to task that boundaries commission to look at the proposition in P2, and for PPC to make sure that when it comes back to this assembly with the legislation to implement it, that it has done so with that evidence base from the Independent Boundaries Commission as part of that. That will be included in that report and will be something that all states members can consider at that point to decide whether we do absolutely want to go ahead with those changes, or if we as members or as PPC decides that the evidence we get leads us to believe that actually there's a couple of tweaks that could be done for it. So if the amendment weren't to be accepted, we wouldn't be specifically directing PPC to bring the Boundaries Commission's evidence into the equation for P2. We'd be saying, go ahead and do P2 even without that evidence, and even with what we can tell so far, which is that it ain't all it's cracked up to be when it comes to voter equity, because of the excellent case that Deputy Curtis made about the numbers here. So I'd say to Deputy Barash, it is worth supporting this now because it brings the principles of the Boundaries Commission and the evidence that they'll gather to inform us into the equation now, whereas if we don't go for it, it won't feature at all in the enabling legislation for P2, and we risk taking a step backwards and doing so without that evidence. I actually don't think I have too much more to say, because most of the speakers in this debate, I think, clearly got what we're trying to do here, which is to not overcomplicate things, not create a new expensive quango, but to use what we've already got more sensibly to provide that decent basis, and avoid the chances of making haphazard changes to our electoral system without the benefit of evidence and data. The whole reason that a Boundaries Commission was initially suggested in that original proposition was because, frankly, it is an embarrassment that we have so many debates about electoral reform that are purely based on supposition and not facts, not data, not actual numbers. It's just what I reckon is what is frequently the argument that's actually pursued in these, when if there's to be an art to it or a formula for determining how you calculate voter equity, you can actually do that properly, and that Boundaries Commission would provide the safeguard to that. Deputy Ayer had mentioned that there wasn't a lot of talk about the Boundaries Commission in that specific debate. I think I'd make 2 points in response to that. The first is that there were actually 2 electoral reform propositions in the previous term. PPC originally brought a one-member, one type of constituency proposition that lost, and then they brought the one that succeeded, which was the hybrid of fair voting districts and constables. And so it was kind of rehashing what had been, I think, developed in a bit more detail in a previous proposition. So that's why you wouldn't be able to cite it if you were looking for it specifically in that proposition. And we probably also didn't dwell on it that much in the debate, because hopefully it goes without saying that you want decent evidence before making these kind of decisions. So I ask the Assembly to support this proposition. It does not prevent any member, if they wish to, from voting in the final proposition for the principle of reintroducing senators into our voting system in some shape or form. It just says, let's have a proper look at what happens to the numbers if you're just cutting a deputy off each district to make sure that it's right, because the better alternative might be to leave 1 or 2 districts as they are, to go a bit further in some districts, or weigh them out in other ways as well. But we can make that decision based on the evidence, knowing that we're enhancing voter representation, not making it worse. And also, sir, bearing in mind that the 2022 reforms were based on old population statistics, because the 2021 census data had not been collated at that point and factored into it. So we actually have even more up-to-date statistics to inform that commission. And so, sir, I make the proposition and call for the appel. Make the amendment, I should say.
Called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. I ask the greffier to open the voting. All members attending in the chamber and remotely with the chance of casting their votes, I ask the greffier to close the voting. Announce the amendment has been rejected. 19 votes pour, 25 votes contre, and 2 abstentions. Yes.
Those voting pour, the Connotabs of St Peter, St John and Grouville, Deputies Southern, Tadier, Ward, Alves, Gardner, Moore, Mesick, Osoph, Coles, War, Renouf, Curtis, Feltham, Kovac, Curtis and Wilson. Those voting contre, the Connotabs of St Helier, St Lawrence, St Brelard, Trinity, St Mary and St Saviour, and Deputies Labby, Luce, Morel, Lehegara, Ayer, Gorst, Farnham, Balash, Miles, Scott, Binney, Miller, Howell, Binney, Ferry, Ward and Andrews, and online, those voting contre, the Connotab of St Juan and Deputy Stevenson, and the Constable of St Clement and the Constable of St Martin, both abstained.
Now move to the 4th amendment lodged by Deputy Moore, and ask the greffier to read the amendment.
Paragraph A. After the words constituencies and substituting, substitute the word 9 with the word 7. After the words in their place, insert the words reducing the number of members within the States Assembly to 47. After paragraph A, insert a new paragraph B as follows and redesignate the subsequent paragraphs accordingly. B, that all funding saved on salaries for the vacated deputy seats should be distributed equally between the senatorial seats. After paragraph A, insert a new paragraph B as follows and redesignate the subsequent paragraphs accordingly. B, that the senators should form the entire Council of Ministers.
Deputy Moore.
Thank you, sir. In 2022, the poll-topping former Senator Valois led a subcommittee of PPC looking at democratic accountability and governance. I believe, sir, that there are still 3 members of the group in the Assembly today, Deputies Gorst, Mezek and Morel. One of their findings was that accountability of the role of Chief Minister within the public arena is lacking as voters do not have a say on who should be elected to the role. Their recommendation to resolve that was that voters should be provided with the opportunity to indicate their preferred candidate for Chief Minister during the voting process. A poll for Chief Minister, sir, has been discussed to an extent, but the arguments for such a poll have generally been shouted down by those who worry that a directly elected Chief Minister would have too many similarities to that of a presidential system. But the simple point that the Democratic Accountability, or the DAG group as it was known, made was that the public quite like the concept of being asked for their opinion and seeing it result in action. This amendment challenges the Assembly to let the public choose who they want to govern them through the automatic elevation of senators to the Council of Ministers. One could also say that if you're going to have senators again, give them a reason for having their different status. One constituent who kindly considered this matter reminded me of these wise words. Democracy gives people a choice in how they are governed, and those in government rule with the consent of the people. The words of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who was then speaking at a Commonwealth Summit in Abuja in 2003. The constituent made the clear distinction in the ability of the people to decide who they wish to govern them, not how they wish to be governed. The role of senator was rendered pointless under the unpopular Le Fondre government when only 3 of 8 senators remained in the government by the end of their term of office. What was the point in asking the people who they wanted to hold an island-wide mandate if those who assumed power are not willing to work with those who are held in high esteem by the public? So this amendment seeks to achieve a number of things if the Assembly is minded to reintroduce the role of senator. Firstly, there should be a point to seeking the island-wide mandate. Prior to 2018, this was certainly the expectation of the majority of successful candidates. In our unicameral system, every member holds a vote. So why not allow the public to choose those who govern them by directly appointing them to the government? It is my hope that if this amendment was adopted, that it would encourage a greater engagement and increase voter turnout at the next elections. The amendment contains 3 elements, and I will ask for them all to be voted upon separately. Firstly, reducing the numbers. And as we discussed yesterday, sir, one objective of this amendment, which correlates with my previous amendment, is to meet another wish of our electors, and that is to reduce the overall number of members in this Assembly, this time, though, to 47, just a small decrease. This maintains the balance of voter equity that was developed under the creation of our current system, I would suggest. Salary. It is often said that our salaries prevent a lot of people from standing for election, as they could not afford to make the pay cut. Whilst only saving the cost of 2 salaries in this proposal, the additional money would help to attract people to stand for election, and it would also provide an acknowledgement of the workload and the responsibility that a minister holds. Whilst I'm proposing a model that is loosely crafted on the Swiss Federal Council, which has been in operation since 1848 and therefore something of a success, one would suggest, it has been, and it still retains the confidence of the public. They work collaboratively, operating on a majority voting system, which would be conducive with our system, which doesn't, of course, generally follow along party lines, with the majority of members being elected as independents. Some have asked whether a council of 7 members could really be enough to govern. Well, the Federal Council appears to have managed that for almost 180 years, governing a nation of what is now just under 9 million people, and a budget that was in 2024 85.7 billion Swiss francs, that's about 75.6 billion pounds. And they held also a 2.6 billion Swiss franc deficit. In fact, it could help to streamline the accounting lines of the departments of the public service too, and that might be something that the current Chief Minister might like to take into account. Of course, there would still be opportunities for deputies and constables to hold delegated responsibilities as assistant ministers. There may be some further details to consider as legislation is amended, such as how the Chief Minister is elected, but those are relatively minor points, I would suggest, and the benefits to the electorate merit the additional work of amending legislation to make a system work. And of course, there will be an opportunity for the Assembly to consider those details when the legislation comes to the Assembly. One detail I should touch on, though, that has been raised by the committee, and I thank them for their comments, the question of how a vote of no confidence would work. Well, of course, firstly, until recently, one of the island's USPs has been political stability, and therefore a vote of no confidence should have a very high bar. In other places, there are mechanisms to call an election if the people want a change of government, and that could be achievable here, I would suggest, if such a situation arose. As the Council of Ministers would be formed of senators, it would only be necessary to hold an election for the island-wide role. I ask members who are minded for change today to consider these additional measures and the positive effect they may have on the relationship that future members of this Assembly will have with those that elect them, and I move the amendment.
Thank you. Is the amendment seconded? Does any member speak on the amendment? If no members, yes, Deputy Rob Ward.
Perhaps for no one's, I don't think it's right to not speak. So it's very interesting. It's really interesting, this one. At first glance, I wondered what on earth it was about, but I'm growing to this. It's a fascinating idea. I will say that one interesting thing is that the Swiss Parliament, I had contradictory information in front of me that actually it's a party political system. There are 7 parties. And there's been a growth of parties. The Green Party recently represented in the Swiss Assembly as they move slightly from the right into the centre, because it's quite a conservative country. So, you know, obviously that's what got me slightly attracted to this. You can have that sort of cooperation when you have clear manifestos stood on in a combined way with detailed commitments made in them, and that's what's needed, I think, for every functioning assembly. But then I would say that, wouldn't I, sir? In terms of the 2 tiers of pay, I'm not so certain about, but, you know, we're going to have a council of ministers of 7 who will bring all of the laws and bring everything forward. You will have to combine ministries. I'm not entirely sure which ministries will be combined. I know they're all very, very busy and there's a huge number of demands made in all of them. So that there's no detail on how that will happen in this. And it removes really, I suppose, if only senators, and if I've got this right, can form the Council of Ministers, you could have a vote of no confidence, the government will fall, and then it will be replaced by the same 7 senators afterwards, who obviously would have had a greater understanding of the error of their ways, which is an interesting form of our politics, and I think a really good idea, because we all need to look sometimes at what we represent and what we bring forward. So, but I can't see any other way. I wrote in my notes about the Magnificent 7 of the 7 senators in this proposition. And I didn't know whether to quote the film or the fantastic song by The Clash, probably the greatest band ever, in my opinion, sir. But there we go. But my real, genuine, serious concerns are if we focus power into the hands of 7, predominantly the most important people in this assembly of 47, there are 40 other members. How do they fit in? One of the real strengths and sometimes the annoyances of the assembly, let's be honest about it for some, is that you need 25 votes. You need a majority to pass legislation. So are we going to erode that away? Because I'd be really concerned about that. That's the uniqueness of our democracy. We're spending days talking about the structure of that yet again, but the unique part of it is that you need 25 votes to pass something in this assembly. Or will everything be done by ministerial decisions and some rescindment to what ministerial decisions can be made and how they're dealt with? That really, genuinely, that concerns me. You know, will the Magnificent Seven be benevolent leaders, so, acting kindly to the lower classes in the Assembly, throwing the crumbs of scrutiny as the lower paid echelons below them look up, only hoping that they would have been elected as senators so they had that power. But I just trying to bring a bit of humour to this debate because it can get somewhat toxic at times. And what happens if one political party gets all 7 ministries? Is that's a mandate. That's the mandate we're looking at. This is more important. That's the most important mandate. So really, we're morally obliged to go along with those 7 ministers from one political party. This is why I'm talking myself into this at the moment. This is slightly concerning, sir. I'm not entirely sure, sir, that this is what the deputy meant by this proposition, but I'm stood here changing my mind on the spot. Well, perhaps it's not such a bad idea now. We could have a mandate. We could stand up every time and say, we've got a mandate from the electorate here for our 7 ministers. You really do need to support this. But so that's the uniqueness of our democracy we don't want to lose. If we ever had one party in a majority, so I'm a bit of a election observation geek. I've been to observe quite a few, both through the CPA, which is a really important organisation when it comes to observations, and we ignore it at our peril, and also through a group called Democracy Volunteers. And every time you go and observe an election, you look really closely at not only the process of that election, but what it leaves behind. There's a marvellous part of the US election which I went to observe on my own back. It didn't cost the taxpayer anything before anyone puts an FOI in. And there's a unique part on their election paper when they vote for president that you can add anyone else's name. It just says anyone else. So you can vote for yourself as president, which I think is a fabulous idea. And every year when they have to try and remove the ones that they think are just joke ones, like Mickey Mouse or someone else or a cartoon character. They have to go through the ballot papers. But that, you could say as a director, it doesn't work because it's concentrating into the hands of the individuals themselves. Perhaps that's something we could do here. So my genuine concerns over this are focusing power into fewer and fewer hands. The difference in pay, because I know what being a chair of a scrutiny panel can entail. It's a huge job. And the constituency work, scrutiny work, developing propositions on your own. There's more support now from the GREF, but then that was not always that. I don't think, and I know how difficult being a minister is and how much work that takes, but I think every member of this assembly, if they're working in the way that I know they do, should be respected for that. I have said before about perhaps the Chief Minister, it's getting more perhaps, depending on how today goes, should receive more simply because it's a figurehead position to have. But so we have to be very careful with this proposition. I'm not sure I will support it, but I'm closer than I ever was. But purely, sir, because I think we would be benevolent leaders and kind to the people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member speak on the Fourth Amendment? Yes, Deputy Miller.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I think Deputy Mayor's amendment requires some very careful and balanced consideration before making a decision as to which way to vote on it. In respect to Part A, I could, in theory, in principle, be persuaded to support a proposition that reinstates 7 senators. My aim is to bring back senators and the island-wide mandate, and I wouldn't especially want to spend too much time debating whether there are 7, 8 or 9 senators. I would settle for any one of those numbers if in exchange I could guarantee that doing so would secure the return of senators alongside maintaining the constables and district deputies. Equally, I can see the argument for having a slightly smaller assembly. I think many members of the public would say that there are too many states members. But that contrasts, however, with the fact that, as Deputy Ward has just alluded, most members are very hard-working in serving the public, and it is important to make that point. This is not by any means a part-time job. I'm not sure it's crucial for the Assembly to have an odd number of states members as opposed to an even number, but in my view that's not something we should debate for too long. So again, I could live with that part of the amendment. What I struggle to agree with, however, is the proposal that the senators, only 7 of them, must form the entire Council of Ministers. I would value, as I'm sure many of us do, an assembly where we have a mix of perspectives from the constables in the parishes, deputies in the districts, and I hope senators island-wide. It would be contradictory of me to say that I value that combination of perspectives and viewpoints in the legislature, but want to exclude it from government. In discussing with the public, I have been clear that in my view and in my proposition, senators may stand for a ministerial post, but they are not obliged to do so, nor are they guaranteed a ministerial post, but equally, that a talented deputy may also stand. With 8 or 9 senators, we would need deputies to stand, and the role of senators is not exclusive. In my view, most importantly, this amendment would move us too far away from our parliamentary system. Effectively, it's stating that the public would directly elect the executive, and that is a fundamental change to our current practices, and that would need very serious consideration. I'm also not at all certain that in our model, 7 ministers will be enough. I think the whole amendment has wider constitutional implications which have not been properly considered. The fact that this system works in Switzerland does not give any certainty at all that it will work here. Our underpinning mechanisms and structures are simply not the same, nor is our heritage and culture, and that is something that we do need to bear in mind. Bolting in something from somewhere else will not necessarily be popular. I'm not saying that the implications of any of these implications are necessarily insurmountable if this is the approach that the Assembly wish to take, but they would need to be discussed, tested at length, and consulted with the public, and go through a much more rigorous process than just one debate on an amendment to a proposition for which we've had a relatively short period of notice. This amendment will also require an amendment to the States of Jersey law, which I think isn't referenced in Deputy Mayor's report, which again shows the amount of further consideration that may be required. And lastly, I would simply say that a very small pay rise is not a sufficient differential, I believe, to encourage people who earn very significantly more to stand for election. I think the question of politicians' pay is one that requires further consideration. So I'm afraid for that reason, sir, I can't support Part C, and I'll be voting against the amendment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Alex Curtis.
Thank you, sir. This amendment to me is like being told to go for a run to Grone and back. It'll probably do me a lot of good, and I'll gain a lot out of it, but it's a bit too far for me to travel in one go. But in all seriousness, I'm glad to follow Deputy Miller, because she said that some of these changes could be quite valid and could achieve quite a lot. Deputy Rob Ward, quite optimistic at the opportunities, and I think he's looking to the future with great enthusiasm. I only rise to give examples of the feedback I've received from constituents, and one of them came back to me, having said, as Deputy Miller will know from the correspondence, that they supported what she was doing. They wanted it to go further. And they came back to me and they said, there have indeed been a number of amendments, a plethora of ideas that have come out of this. Most of these have some merit. And I really hope members, even though they've seemed so staunchly against some of the propositions, recognise some of the merit, despite the outcome on Deputy Messick's second amendment. But it says here the latest one, I think, is that of Deputy Christina Moore. I believe that this one is the closest to my hope of having a chance to influence how we're governed and not merely by whom, as I think the mover of this amendment highlighted similar feedback from people. And that's a really interesting thing to talk about. But the one line I want to take out of this was, considering the number and variety of suggestions, I have now come to the view that this is a matter that needs much greater thought and consultation, so should not be rushed through in time for the next election. Always provided that it is not just kicked down the road, and then says, like building the hospital, and I'm sure other political comments will come out of that. But the short of it is, Deputy Miller has said these are significant changes. Well, what Deputy Miller as well is proposing are significant changes again. She proposed it's always good when making a change to consult in her response just now to this amendment. And so I'm afraid I can't support Deputy Moore in this amendment. I would rather we do look at the wider picture as to how to create a more effective government and a more effective assembly, which may involve changes as to how we choose our ministers, choose our chief minister, but we should do that in the round as to how to have a fair, representative and effective assembly, and not necessarily by making continuous piecemeal changes. So I'll leave it there, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Scott.
So I was not going to speak to this amendment. I did not feel it necessary to point out the speech I raised to object to the Deputy's similar proposed amendment to the first amendment equally applies here. I thank Deputy Ward for exploring the possible undisclosed consequences of the amendment. I think it's very important that states members do not unintentionally allow a political party to have power that does not represent the extent of their electoral support. We do need to vote with clear and sharp eyes. Did that happen with the current arrangements? Would the current States Assembly have supported them had they been presented with them today? And how would our electorate feel about them? And I think much of that comes down to this. I think in this case of this amendment and in the case of my electorate, for the reasons that have been raised in the debate so far, that I don't believe they would be supporting this proposition.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Taddeo.
Thank you, sir. Let's start with, sorry, I'm just trying to find my notes with all these screens open. I'm going to do it from memory if I know, here it is. So they say start with your strongest points, don't they, sir? And which might also be possibly the most comedic points at this point in the afternoon where we need a lift. And I think Deputy Ward started us off very well. So let's look at what this might entail. So if I understand correctly, instead of having 8 senators, we have 7. That's fine, that's straightforward. We've not tried 7 yet, and we've established it's a nice round number, 1 for every day of the week. So something for everyone potentially. Now, if we look at the election in 2014, I think it was, 2018 rather, so the last senatorial election, if you like, last full senatorial election, what would have happened then is that you would have had Deputy Valois go straight into the Council of Ministers. That's good. Some people said she should have been there anyway. I think she was initially for a bit. Deputy Moore, Senator Moore was in there, and I think, interestingly enough, she didn't become a minister, did she? She was relegated, shall we say, to the humble backbenchers of leading the very important scrutiny panels and chairing that. And then we had Senator Lafondre, who came third, but did find his way not just to becoming a minister, but to becoming a chief minister. Then we had Senator Farnham, Senator Pallett, Senator Gorst, Senator Ferguson and Senator Mezek. Now, I can see, of course, why she's gone for 7 seats instead of 8. Eliminate your enemies straight away. I'll come back to that in a moment. So we know why it's 7. But what a great Council of Ministers that would have been. They wouldn't have had to seek a mandate from the Assembly. We'd have had a Council of Ministers with those 7 who have got a public mandate. All of them would have worked together great, wouldn't they? We'd have seen, because we know Senator Moore and Senator Lafondre and Senator Farnham would have been all working together shoulder to shoulder in the best interests of Jersey, and they'd have commanded the respect of a united Assembly. The good thing about this model is that instead of just getting 1 Chief Minister, you get basically 4 Chief Ministers for the price of 1. Because, in fact, I think 4 of them, by my counts, Senator Moore, excuse me if I got the titles wrong, but yeah, Senators Moore, Lafondre, Farnham and Gorst have all been Chief Ministers. And possibly if we'd have extended it to the 8th candidate who got elected in that election, it might be a Chief Minister in waiting, who can tell. So maybe we should have stuck with 8 rather than just 7. I think that's the first pitfall, isn't it? Because surely it's a vast departure from what we have, is that we have an indirect democracy where the executive is chosen from within the Assembly, and it's the best of a good bunch, hopefully, that will be put forward, and it's done on needing to see who else has been elected. I think that's the key point. And I think certainly if this were to work, you would definitely need a different election day, because I think you'd need to find out who the ministers are, because you might not want to work with them if you're considering running for deputy, and they might also wish to make sure that some of the people they want to work with them, because I don't think the proposal at the moment is that we give the executive the ability to appoint ministers from without the Assembly. That's not a very Commonwealth or Jersey model. It would certainly represent a departure from the norm. The second point, I think, just to go on about build on what Deputy Ward has said, is maybe just be careful what you wish for, because actually, and this goes back to the Electoral Commission and other academics that have talked about the perils of what we have in a majoritarian voting system with effectively first past the post. And it's quite well documented that whilst there can be distortions and it's easier to understand in single seat constituencies, for example, we know if there's a contest in a by-election for deputy or for senator in the future, but certainly if there's an ordinary election for constable which attracts more than 2 candidates, you get a potential problem, of course, of somebody not winning with absolute support of the constituency under the current first-past-the-post model. I think that's well understood, because you could have your one candidate getting in with 40% of the vote, and the 60% is split equally between the other 2 candidates at 30% each. Therefore, you've quite possibly got somebody without the majority support of that constituency. The AV, the alternative votes, obviously takes care of that issue. And what is interesting to note is that the Electoral Commission of 2013 was also made recommendations on the voting system. And what they recognised is that it's possible in an electoral system, especially when you have 7 votes and 7 seats up for grabs, that a large minority in the electorate can control, or rather a party or a grouping. It doesn't have to be an official party, it could be a group of like-minded or similar profiled candidates can take all of the seats. And that isn't necessarily one particular party over another, but it could well be that it might well be Reform Jersey or the Liberal Conservatives or a yet unformed party who have got large minority support in the island could get all of the 7 seats, and then you would find out that you've actually got a majority in government without necessarily having majority support in the wider public. So if we are to go down this route, we definitely need to look at reforming our voting system, because there are definite perils in that. And what did the Electoral Commission say when it came to the recommendations around that? They said that the recommendation, the Commission, on which former Senator Balash, but Deputy Balash, who's still with us, and Deputy Renouf, amongst others, and the lay members on that, said that consideration should be given to a single transferable vote for those multi-seat constituencies, that the STV is a voting system that more accurately reflects the will of the voters' preferences than first past the post does, and it results in fewer wasted votes, and they've given lots of other arguments for that. And this is where it's key to coming back to actually the underlying spirit of Protocol 1, Article 3 of the ECHR, is that it's important that there aren't just free elections, but that the will of the electorate can be conveyed not just in a meaningful way and freely, but also accurately. We need to know what the will of the electorate is in order to convert that into political results. And of course, different voting systems achieve different results. And again, I wish this is something that will be taught in schools, because it's absolutely fundamental. Different results, different voting systems produce different outcomes, all of which potentially have winners and losers, but some of which are much fairer than others, depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. And the ultimate goal is to make sure that we have a reflection of the will of the people. And of course, that reflection must also take into account minority voices as well as majoritarian voices. So it's entirely possible, for example, that of course, in that election where there was only one party candidate, one Reform candidate, we got one seat in that election. But as soon as you have 4, 5, 6, 7 candidates standing for any one party in that election, it is entirely likely that when the votes come in, especially from the well-established voter bases, that you don't just see one candidate propelled towards the 8th place potentially, or the 7th place in that list. You actually find that 7 candidates get propelled to maybe the top 5, the top 7, whatever it is. And that is great. If you're a party member like us in Reform, we would relish that, I think. And this isn't just hypothetical. Let's look at what happened in previous elections. I still keep in contact with former Senator McLean, who's a parishioner, lives in St. Brelard, and he's a well-respected politician during his time, and I think still now. He came to the meeting in St. Brelard's, and he participated in that when we had it. And the votes were coming in throughout the island, I think, when there were 6 seats up for grabs. And he said, I wasn't too worried when I was coming in 8th or 9th or 7th in St. John or in St. Lawrence or in St. Wands, because I knew my constituency base of St. Saviour was to come. And as soon as that result came in, hey presto, I remember it well, I think it was 2005, he was on the back of a great campaign on opposing the introduction of GST, or the increase in GST. When the St. Saviour vote came in, he's right up there being pushed into maybe 5th place. And then when the St. Helier vote comes in, the St. Clement vote, he's there right at the top. And that's just one candidate. Imagine what you can do with 7 candidates. That's the beauty of party politics. There is a risk here, though, because what if 6 Reform members get elected, but only 1 Liberal Conservative gets elected to senator? It puts us in a really difficult position. Do we make the Liberal Conservative the Chief Minister? Or do we make them the Treasury Minister? And of course, what about the other deputy that they've got elected in the election a few weeks later? They might find themselves not in a position to be on the Council of Ministers. So I think we have to be really careful about what we're voting for. It's an interesting idea in principle. That's before we get on to the differential pay. But I think we'd certainly be up for that. We think it would be beneficial to our party, but on the balances of whether it's in the interests of the public and whether it's a good way to do this on a whim, I think we'd probably have to stick with the fact that this isn't the way to do electoral reform, even though it might be beneficial to us as a party.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Coles.
Thank you, sir. I will start with the unfortunate point, because the Deputy made reference to the DAG recommendations, and of course one of those recommendations was that every ministerial role should have a minister, and as already been mentioned by Deputy Ward, that obviously 7 is too few to fill those roles. So would we be in a position where we're trying to meet the DAG report in one way by having direct representation, but we lose it by not hitting the other marks? So that's the first thing, and it's probably not necessarily the main, but this amendment poses a very interesting position that if we're going to have senators, why not have them have a different role? Because at the moment they would come back into this chamber and have the same voting power, same voting rights, same access to roles as every single single type of member. And it then gets me into thinking more, and unfortunately we didn't have time as a party to really discuss this before maybe presenting alternative amendments to this amendment, because it does come up with an interesting idea about maybe putting senators into a Senate. We hear quite a lot, and we've seen quite a few recently where just small maybe spelling mistakes or technical errors within our legislation comes through, and then we have to have quick emergency amendments to that legislation being pushed through quite quickly. So this gives it the thought and possibly the idea of actually having a second chamber, moving from a unicameral to a bicameral chamber. Having these senators there come in to just do scrutiny would have been my preferred option, if I'm honest, rather than putting them directly into the Council of Ministers. I think that's a bit of a struggle and a bit of a push for me. They could have been assisted in that upper chamber, if we can call it an upper chamber. We could move the constables up into there so they could focus on scrutiny work and their parish work. And that would leave 30 members of this assembly if we went with the numbers that are proposed, which would be quite nice because then you could form the executive out of that 30, which would leave maybe 9 or 10 additional members who could then help again within the scrutiny ranks to then bring it all back to the assembly. Whether these senators would have voting rights in here, that'd be another thing we could debate again. But like I said, it's not all being thought through in this, and this is where we talk about then needing the ability to think through suggestions better, to communicate and discuss better. But I'm not saying that this amendment isn't without its legs. I think it has some really, really good ideas and really, really good concepts. But unfortunately, in its current form, I can't be supporting it. But I think it's a good amendment with good ideas. And maybe if we do discuss some reforms of this assembly again, we could look at a bicameral formation and see what we can do.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Ozef.
So I will be brief. Sir, some of us in this assembly have been senators before. Some of us have topped the poll. Some of us have come ninth, I think, and eighth in the last thing. I understand why former Senator Deputy Moore is bringing this, because I have a feeling, I haven't actually discussed it with the Deputy, apart from a very brief conversation, but I know that the feelings of the island were in the last election that they did want to change from the last government, and they voted in favour of change. And then they got change initially, and then they didn't have it. And now I've been literally, sir, outside in the street, and I've spoken to 3 people who've basically expressed the view. I know it's only people that have told me. They've all said to me the same thing. What are you doing talking about yourselves again, rather than the issues that actually are really worrying us? And here we are, and I'm not going to use any of my minutes that I've got much by saying that I think that this notion of the island-wide automatically being in government is fine in Switzerland. It worked quite well, but I'm afraid we're not Switzerland, and this sounds like another piece of Tris cheese. It's basically an odd system, and as the previous speaker said, I think there is a debate to be had about, and I think I've spoken certainly to other members in this assembly, about a second chamber, sir. It might be quite useful because we're really bad at scrutinising legislation, and maybe an upper house could be with senators in the future, because we're really bad at doing scrutiny of legislation. We've said it, and we know it, and we should be better at it. Democracies that have senators, sir, should have a senate. Most people, when I was a minister, sir, thought I was actually sitting in a senate. I wasn't. I was actually in an Assemblée parlementaire de Jersey with 3 different parts of members. So I do not accept that people who poll top and become the top 7 should be part of the executive, sir. It's a fundamental change, and I don't think we should confuse popularity with suitability for ministerial responsibility. I think that we must create in all parts of these amendments a creation or the proposal that creating a super member. We've got super constituencies, that's fine, sir, but no super members, please, sir, because we need to maintain the principle that all of us in here are equal. It's a big leveller, sir, when you top the poll in the senators and you get cut down and you have to sit with deputies. I've done it before, because we're all equal. And that's really important on a good system where we all get elected. I cannot support with deep regret, but I understand it's a good proposal by the deputy. I'm going to abstain on this one, because I think the mover of the proposition makes a really interesting point about what you could do with senators if they were brought back. And if you are going to bring them back, we need mature and lengthy consideration before we do it. They could be either maybe members of the executive. The last member of the upper house that was a minister in the UK was David Cameron, who was made a lord. And I'm not saying we should have their lordships, but we do need to look at the way we do things. And if we're going to mature as a jurisdiction, then maybe a second chamber, sir, which you can still preside over if you want, sir. Got no problem with that. I know it's not compliant with Latimer House, but it's all right. But that's a bit that we can deal with. But we should not pick and choose on the fundamental human rights. And I don't think that basically populism is what we want, and populism is definitely a senatorial election that puts people in the executive. Thank you, sir.
So, can I correct something I said? I think I misspoke when I mentioned,
yes.
I meant to say former Senator Alan Brecken, and I think I got the name wrong. So, just to clarify, I don't know how that happened, it's my brain, obviously.
Yes, that's fine, thank you. Conor St Helier.
Thank you, sir. I think some members are too polite to say it, but we can't tie the hands of a future assembly by saying that all the senators will be ministers. People who've been here longer will remember people who've stood for senator on particular platforms. They said, if I'm elected, I want to be such and such a minister. As soon as they've made their speech in the assembly after the election, states members have looked at each other and thought, well, we're not going to have that person running that particular department. And the person that was elected is very upset because they feel that they've been elected to do a particular job. It's this assembly's job to decide who's going to run the executive. It's not something we put out for public vote. There have been some really nice senators in my time, really lovely people, but you would not have put them in charge of a village fete, quite honestly. I'm sure they've done great constituency work, but they simply weren't suitable for that kind of executive role. So I really can't support item C in this, nor do I really think there's any logic in giving any savings, which is part B, to the senators. I actually think it's better to give those savings to people who are doing the heavy lifting in government and to start with the chief minister, perhaps the next chief minister, give him or her a little extra money. The first part, which is going for 7 rather than 9, I actually quite like because I prefer the number 7 to 9, as it happens. I think it could also lend itself to, as Deputy Alex Curtis was saying in an earlier debate, to not taking a deputy seat out of the 2 St Helier districts that are going to be particularly affected by the main proposition taking 9 senators. So I'm minded to support Part A, which is to only take 7, to only have 7 senators, but not to support the other parts of the proposition. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conor Tarr. Is any other motion to speak on the 4th Amendment? Deputy Mezek.
Thank you, sir. I served on that BBC subcommittee that Deputy Moore mentioned in the previous term. We produced a report and made recommendations about some tweaks that could be made to our government system, some of which were relatively simple, some of which required a little bit more thinking, but it was a good process to go through to look at it all and try to think of ways to improve it. I know Deputy Coles chairs that sub-panel now and is doing continuing on that work. What that subcommittee didn't act as, though, is some kind of second clothier review, doing an absolutely comprehensive view of our government system with a view to proposing quite radical changes. I think it's fair to describe what Deputy Moore is proposing in this as, for at least the Jersey context, being quite radical. But I don't deprecate her at all for that. In fact, I commend her for thinking outside of the box and trying to come up with some way of altering our system in such a way that gets to a point here, which is that there are different ways in which you can offer the public a say in who actually governs them. And the version that we have now doesn't have to be the version that we have forevermore. It's not the one that we had before 2005, and there are all sorts of different permutations that we could go for. And so Deputy Moore proposing that there is essentially a direct election to the Council of Ministers for the public is not a completely outlandish idea. I think in the way that she's proposed it, it certainly has some flaws. we would be voting for people not just to be automatically members of the Council of Ministers, but also to be members of this Parliament at the same time, a dual role, whereas at the moment you acquire that dual role by assent of the Assembly, not directly from the public. And of course that does pose problems which other members have referred to. You know, what happens if the public, for completely good reasons, exercises their verdict on who they want to vote for those 7 senators / ministers, and we suddenly find that of the 7 people elected, none of them have the faintest interest in health policy, but of those who are elected deputy, you get a handful who've got really good direct experience of the system and would make great ministers, but you couldn't elevate them in such way because that wouldn't be permitted under this system. It, of course, doesn't address the issue as to what happens if there's a fallout of some kind, and that collective of ministers either themselves can't work together, or they find themselves actually working together very well with a united sense of purpose and having a policy agenda that they're keen to see through. And then they come to this assembly and find that a majority of the rest of the membership simply votes them down on everything. We'd end up in a complete stalemate with government completely unable to work. And in that instance, who has supremacy? Because the public have directly elected the Council of Ministers, but they've also directly elected the rest of the membership of the States Assembly, whose members have their own mandates as well. And nobody who's elected to this Assembly and not to the government has any duty to just be a slave to whatever the government says. They have their own personal mandate and can say no to anything they like, and that's not undemocratic. So there's some real difficulties with that. The recommendation from that subcommittee that this stems from was a recommendation about looking into a way that the public could have a more direct say on who it is. If I remember rightly, the recommendation was specifically about Chief Minister rather than the entirety of the Council of Ministers. And again, that's getting at a really important point here, which is that the public don't ever actually get asked, who do you want to lead your government and whose policy platform do you find most enticing and want to give a mandate? We don't have that in our system. We won't have that in our system with reintroducing senators either, so it's not a unique point to the senators. When I was first elected in March 2013, the first proposition that I brought to this Assembly, in line with my manifesto that I'd just been elected on, was to propose that there ought to be a direct election for Chief Minister, and that once there'd been the general election for the States Assembly, the states should nominate a series of candidates to be Chief Minister. So it's the states nominating the candidates, and then the public would have a vote in, and you call it a presidential type election if you want. I suppose that is kind of what it would be. And then that person would take on the role of Chief Minister. But I made the point when I proposed that, was that I was offering that as a mechanism for the public to choose who heads their government, but it's not actually the mechanism I preferred. The mechanism I preferred was party politics, where when you vote for your local candidate, you're not just voting for your local representative, you're voting for their party platform, knowing that the leader of that party would be the one who'd end up being Chief Minister. And so you would be ideally providing a parliamentary majority in the Parliament to then construct an executive, and the head of that executive would be exactly who you'd expect it to be based on who you gave that majority for. So that's another mechanism of giving the public a slightly less direct say on who leads the government. But so that there's other ways that this could be done as well. On Sunday, I believe, our sister island, Madeira, goes to the polls, and we'll be having an election there. It's about their third one in the last 2 years because their governments keep collapsing. And obviously in this part of the Assembly, we're wishing all the best to our good friends and comrades in the Partido Socialista, who their membership is great friends of Jersey as well. But their system is very interesting, where they will be having their general election. It's an island-wide constituency, only one constituency, one type of member, but you don't vote for candidates, you vote for parties, and if your party gets 20% of the vote, it gets 20% of the seats, which is perfectly fair. Their parliament is then composed by those who have been elected from those party lists. Their first job then is to elect the president of Madeira. When the president is appointed, they then appoint their cabinet, but you're not allowed to serve as president or cabinet member and a member of the parliament. So if you have, if your president appoints somebody to a ministerial position, they have to give up their seat in the parliament, and the person who is next on the list comes up and takes their place. So the first meeting of that parliament, where they vote for their president, about 10 or so of those people then won't be at the next parliamentary meeting because they'll probably have been bumped up to cabinet positions then. So there's a separation between the executive and the legislature, and that's fine because you'll have a parliamentary majority for the government. If it's a coalition, it can fall apart if the coalition falls apart, but Parliament will focus on its legislative responsibilities and the executive members focus on the executive responsibilities. I've got to say, sir, I quite like that idea, and I think that would work very well in Jersey, to have all members elected on an island-wide basis through a party list system. We then elect our cabinet. The cabinet doesn't sit in the assembly, but is appointed by it. You could have fewer members of the assembly then, because they'd purely be focusing on legislature work, whereas the executive would be focusing on executive work. Other places do it. That would be perfectly feasible and democratic, and there were safeguards within it. What Deputy Moore proposes doesn't really have any of those safeguards, and though we can point to perhaps similarities that might exist in other places like Switzerland, it's not quite the same. There are different safeguards in those systems as well that are not replicated in what Deputy Moore is proposing. So, sir, I think there is only one thing to be done with this amendment, which is to vote against it. But I haven't given it short shrift like I did her previous amendment, because I think the point that she's getting to here about democratic accountability and the ability of the public to actually choose who heads the government is absolutely one we ought to be exploring. But this won't deliver it, and reintroducing senators without this stipulation that they make up the council ministers doesn't do it either, because, as Deputy Moore rightly said, in the last term of office with senators, by the end of the term, most senators weren't part of the government. Some of that transition happened mid-term, which could happen within the system she's proposing now anyway. And in the vote for Chief Minister, 4 senators voted for one candidate and the other 4 senators voted for the other candidate. So they actually didn't decide who the Chief Minister was. It was the deputies who decided who the Chief Minister was in that system. So fair play to Deputy Moore for coming up with an innovative idea and provoking the debate. But if we were to have bigger changes to how our executive is made up, it probably requires a different approach in order to make that work and provide the democratic safeguards. But I say, sir, let's be open to it. There's no reason we have to have the system we've currently got. Let's think bigger and bolder in the future.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on this amendment? I call upon Deputy Moore, Deputy Gardner.
Very quickly follow Deputy Mazik, because I really enjoy listening speech of Deputy Mazik. We can see how the debate is going, but I would like, and I did vote against the first amendment, because first amendment was, for me, we have 8-7, just about the numbers. It's connecting to my first speech in this debate. The public are not connected. We didn't manage to explain to the public how the system works for them and benefit them. And I believe that public actually said really clear in the referendum was less states members. It was, I think, 42 compared to 49. So this amendment offering us an option to have 42 members. When I went to the parish meetings, even small they were, there were people definitely raised why we would have senators. Would they have another job? Would they have a different job? I completely recognize that this amendment is very complex. It's very bold. It's very initiative, and it's very difficult to implement it before the next elections. It's really, really difficult to implement proper before the next elections and answer all questions that Deputy Mazik raised in his great speech. But as a matter of principle, I believe the system needs to be changed. This system doesn't work. And this is why I would like to say thank you for Deputy Moore to bring in this amendment. We do need to have different roles, and I might support it on the principle. I'll think about it.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member speak on the amendment? I call upon Deputy Moore to reply. Deputy Moore.
Thank you, sir, and I thank all those who have taken the time to speak in this debate, and also who have taken the time to consider some of the ideas that have been brought forward in this amendment. And actually, I think the very last thing that Deputy Gardner said there, I should emphasise and re-emphasise to members, this is a debate in principle. And these matters will have to be formed into legislation, whatever is decided as a result of the debate today, and they will be then scrutinised, and they can be amended even at a later date when whatever is decided today comes back in a legislative form. I think in hearing the comments of people around the Assembly today, I've certainly talked myself into supporting the PPC's amendment to bring forward these changes for 2030 instead of 2026, because there are indeed some matters to consider and some work to do to finesse the in-principle decisions that we take today and turn them into an exact set of rules that will be brought into legislation. So, sir, I think that why we're here today, and many members have asked themselves that question, why are we constantly returning to this conversation of the composition of this Assembly? We know the frustration that members of the public have, that there are so many other things we should be talking about today, and yet we come back to this point because we ultimately understand that there is a level of frustration within our community that something does not work, which is why I guess this amendment came about, through considering various debates, various principles, talking to other parliamentarians around the world and hearing how different things work in different places, and suggesting that, hey, there might be a better way. So we know, first and foremost, that reducing the number of members is one part, and of course this is an amendment that will come in separate parts, and members can vote or for or against as they see fit. The Swiss example, I think, has been considered a lot by various members around the House, but that was simply an example. I'm not suggesting an exact replication of their system, but simply using it as an example of something that seems to have worked effectively over a considerable period of years. And yes, Deputy Ward was absolutely right that they do have a party political system, and I perhaps misspoke in my opening, but I feel that the collaborative work that they deliver through the construction of that particular council would equally apply to our non-party or fewer party construction here, where we mostly work as independents and try to drive consensus between a group of individuals. So, sir, I do think that this would not be putting power in a fewer number of hands. Yes, the number 7 is smaller than the current makeup of the Council of Ministers, which is, of course, I believe, 11. It is simply doing what the public have been asking for, and asking for a greater say in those who lead and govern them. And I believe that this simple suggestion would help to enable that. I do believe that we could have 7 ministers leading 7 departments, and that some work could be done to refine those departments and drive forward a leaner, more focused public sector. I know that because I was doing that work in my former role, and I absolutely believe it is achievable. Differential pay, I would agree with Deputy Miller that £15,000 or thereabouts perhaps would not be the amount of money that would encourage a vast number of additional people to consider standing for election, but it is an improvement on the current state of affairs, and it's something that I think we should consider. I think in closing I should just go back to the work of the Democratic Accountability Group. It did look at a wide range of matters that can deeply affect our relationship with our voters and hopefully encourage them to turn out to vote and get more involved in our elections going forward, because we have a huge democratic deficit. Over 30 years, we have averaged 44% voter turnout. We're at the bottom of the league tables, and at the next elections, we'll be even further beneath that bottom plank unless something changes considerably, as we will have automatic voter registration, and therefore, unless something radical changes, we're likely to see our voter turnout fall rather than increase, and that's something that I think would be an incredibly sad thing, and it would be a very bad example. Well, it would just be a very bad state of affairs, and I do hope that that does not happen, but we need to think about how we engage with our electors and how they see what they vote for at the ballot box returned in this assembly and taken forward. So thank you all for your consideration. I do ask for the appel, sir, and I'd like, as I've said, to take each item separately.
Yes, in relation to that, Deputy Moore, of course, you're entitled to ask for 3 separate votes. But Part A reduces the number of senators from 9 to 7, and then the second part deals with any consequential funding saved. So I hope you accept that if the first part is rejected, then the second part falls away.
That's a very good point, sir, yes.
But in any event, there'll be a vote on the third part. So the appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats, and I ask the greffier to open the voting on the first part of the amendment, which reduces inter alia the number of senators from 9 to 7. Members have the opportunity of casting their votes. I ask the greffier to close the voting. I can announce that the first part of the proposition has been rejected. 8 votes pour and 37 votes contre. Yes.
Those voting for the Conotabs of St Helier and St John, and Deputies Gardner, Gorst, Moore, Balash, Moore and Stevenson.
The second part falls away, so we've turned to the third and final part of the amendment, that the senators should form the entire Council of Ministers. I invite the greffier to open the voting. If all members have the opportunity of casting their votes, I ask the greffier to close the voting. announce that the final part of the amendment has been rejected. 3 votes pour, 42 votes contra.
Those voting for, Deputies Gardner, Moore and Stevenson.
The 5th amendment has been lodged by Deputy Tadier, and I invite the greffier to read the amendment.
After paragraph A, insert the following new paragraph B and redesignate the subsequent paragraph accordingly. B, that the election for senators should be held in advance of the deadline for nomination of any other class of candidate for election as a States Assembly member.
Deputy Tadier.
Thanks, sir. I know we've been here a long time, so this isn't going to be especially long, sir. I do ask members for, and thank members in advance for their attention, if not their indulgence. So it's important to remind ourselves that between 1948 and 2011, the elections for senator were always held separately and before the elections for deputies. So you might hear me talk about a separate election day, but of course what I'm talking about is a separate election period, because the period for senators under what I'm proposing and what used to be the case is that it would always happen first. Once the senators were elected, then a separate election period was opened for the other seats, which, as we know, that fell away when a general election was on the cards. Now, there were good reasons for this, and I think there are good reasons for this today, if we are indeed to bring back the island-wide mandate. I think there are compelling reasons why senatorial elections should take place prior to the nomination day for the other 2 officers, and I'll outline those now. By the way, for clarification, this amendment is, of course, agnostic on the wider question of the reintroduction of senators, which we'll be coming to shortly. But it does say that, of course, the motive here is that if senators are to be brought back, then that election should take precedence over the election of deputies and constables in terms of timing. So there's been a perception, and it's been repeated at the meeting I went to, and I think at the parish assemblies that Deputy Miller put on and that were attended, which is supported by the supporters of the role of senator, some of whom are, of course, in this assembly, that the politician who is eventually elected as chief minister should have an island-wide mandate, certainly if an island-wide mandate exists. So whilst there's no official rule about this, it is certainly true that since the creation of ministerial government in 2005, all holders of that office have been senators, of course, until the role of senator was abolished for the 2022 general election. So it had also almost become a convention that only senators could hold the top job. And I think if we go back even before we had ministerial government, the heads of the main committee, which effectively was the chief minister before, they always, I think, tended to have, they had a senatorial mandate, certainly the ones I can remember. It's worth noting, of course, that even after the abolition of senator, all the candidates even that have put themselves forward for chief minister in 2022, they had all held the office of senator at one point. So I think in particular of deputies Mezek, Moore, Farnham and Gorst now, they've all held the position of senator in the past. Perhaps something which is, maybe why they felt they could put themselves forward for the chief ministerial role, even though it wasn't a fresh mandate necessarily. So in the mind of the public, some of whom feel aggrieved that they cannot vote for the chief minister directly, the ability to choose whatever number it is, I think we're settling on 8 finally, isn't it? 9? We'll get there. In my report, I put 6, 8, 9, 12. It could have been 7, but it's not, it's 9. So there was a feeling that you're choosing the pool from which the chief minister will be chosen. So in many ways, it's timely that we're debating this now after the debate we've had on Deputy Moore's proposal, because I think it's still true that if we do have senators back, I think we can all agree that there'll be that strong expectation that even though not all senators will become ministers, because some of them might want to do very valuable scrutiny work, and I think it's often been the case in the past that the person who takes the job on for scrutiny chair, the scrutiny liaison committee, probably in my mind should have a senatorial role if one exists, but that's ultimately for the Assembly, but definitely the public, and I think this Assembly, the future Assembly, wouldn't countenance that job going to somebody without an island-wide mandate. Whether that's right or wrong, we can make arguments for and against, but I think that is the way I perceive it. Now, given this logic, it makes good sense that the senatorial election should therefore be a standalone election. Why? Because this would allow the public and the media to focus their attention on what is being said by those vying for senior office, without the distraction of parish and district elections. Similarly, it would assure that when those other elections do take place, the focus can then be on those elections. And I can say that from experience. I think it's really difficult, certainly, to try and get your message out, no matter which of those elections you're standing in, because there's all three elections happening at the same time. These are three elections we're talking about, all happening on the same day. The downside is that it does provide a difficulty in terms of people and the media as to where to put their focus. Which elections are more important? Is the focus going to be on what's being said at the senatorial elections, which are doing, something like 15 hustings, certainly all 12 parishes? Which ones do you attend? And how much time do you spend door knocking if you're perhaps one of the other candidates? And how do you listen to the narrative that's developing during the senatorial elections? It's very difficult, I think, for all those involved to concentrate on three elections at the same time. So the choice for the media, of course, is whether to cover all of these meetings, how much column space, airtime to give to other election candidates who are, after all, in the majority. So even after this, even if we do bring back senators, the majority of the membership, of course, will be non-senators, and they will hold, of course, much more power in terms of voting and influence in this Assembly. So at a general election, interest invariably sits with the candidates that every voter can vote for, the senators. So it's normal that the interest would be in those, potentially to the detriment of the other officers. Another consideration, which I think we do need to bear in mind, and which might be beneficial, is that having a slate of senators elected before the other roles would allow more time for the prospective chief ministerial candidates to put together their policy positions in a more coherent form, so to form a programme of government for that term of office. It could also allow those senators-elect to campaign on behalf of those yet to be elected constable and deputy candidates who they might be hoping to have in their cabinet, because of course they can't do anything with just senators. Now, it was argued, and I've titled this section "The Nail in the Coffin of the Senators." It was argued by some at the time that the final nail in the coffin of the senators was when the states decided in 2010 to move to a single election day. I don't know if we all agree with that, but certainly that's a point of view that's put forward. A single election day highlighted in the mind of the public and politicians the fact that all three positions, constable, deputies and senators, were effectively all the same, and diluted the focus between the senatorial and the other elections. All members could put themselves forward for any role once elected into the Assembly. They had the same voice, the same vote, and this led to the obvious conclusion that there was no real difference between senators and deputies. Sure enough, during the last term, the island-wide mandate was finally abolished, and one of the arguments that prevailed was that it was confusing to ask voters to elect three types of politician all on the same day when there was no difference between them once they were all elected. So it goes back to the point I made earlier about, are we going to build the senators on sand, or are we going to build it on a more stable footing? And actually, if we are going to go back to senators, the arguments before were you had a different election day for 7 or 8 of those decades for a good reason. And as soon as it was changed, that led, I believe, it's one of the contributing factors to the demise of the island-wide role. So if you support the bringing back of senators, I'd strongly ask you to consider supporting moving to a different election day for senators. It's also got to be noted that contesting an island-wide campaign is usually much more financially costly for the candidate than contesting a district or parish election. So why would a popular local constable or deputy put themselves forward for senator for fear that if they did not get quite enough votes, they would be denied the opportunity to represent a constituency that they really love and where they still may be popular? So this, of course, does give an option for those to stand. I know cynics would say that this is called the second bite of the cherry, but ultimately it's about providing choice for the electorate. So if you've put yourself forward for election, don't get elected as senator, you go back to your constituency because they've obviously asked you and said, look, would you consider running for constable? We don't want to lose you. We want you in the States Assembly. We were quite happy to support you for senator, but we want you back doing an important role for the local district. You would have the opportunity to do that. Ultimately, it's up to the electorate, of course, whether they like that, but they would be given the choice at the ballot box. Something, again, which happened consistently between 1948 and 2011. Now, there's also this concept of, this is my last part, so the concept of stepping up. So I went to the St. Brelard meeting. I counted that there were 16 members of the public there who were not current States members, 2 of whom were former States members. That was in February. And at that meeting, several members of the public stated they thought that a senator should first have served a term as deputy, some even suggesting that it should be a requirement. Now, of course, that's not always the case, but I think that's something that I've heard repeated over the years, and there's this idea that there's an expectation for deputies or constables to step up. And of course, we've seen there's some notable members of this assembly, like I think of the late constable of St. Clement, who did, of course, all 3 roles when they existed, not necessarily in that order. He stepped up, if we can call it that, to senator from deputy, and then he stepped up again to become a constable. So he didn't let the island-wide mandate limit his ambition there. And of course, I say these things, I don't necessarily believe in this hierarchy, by the way. I firmly believe that once we're here in the Assembly, we're all the same, we have the same voting power, but there is a perception out there that if we are to have senators back, let's be honest about it, there has to be some kind of difference in perception, and I think that's why we get back to the point of Chief Minister and the desire somehow that the public wish to form or have some say in the direction of travel. So, on the matter of a separate election day, there was also strong support from those present that I asked, and it was recognised that this would likely give the electorate a wider choice of candidate who would stand for election, as well as giving some deputies, constables, the opportunity to step up to senator. If I can just say this as an aside, what we've seen, I think, since the single election day was brought in, you had the established political heavyweights stand for election, pretty much no one else, and then what I would call the unknowns, which some people unkindly call the no-hopers, because unfortunately the way the election is stacked for senators, unless you're well known and you may have some great ideas, there's no hope in a likely scenario that you will get elected, sir. So it actually does potentially decrease the choice for the electorate ultimately, leading to an observation, I think, again, I'll get his name right this time, Alan Brecken, former Senator Brecken, who came to our meeting and said, the same people get elected anyway, it doesn't matter whether they're senators or deputies, so maybe it would give a bit more choice as to ultimately who decides to put themselves forward. So certainly they were clear that there were some deputies they would not want to lose as local representatives, which might be the case if, as I said, a popular deputy or constable were unable to secure votes in other parts of the island simply due to being unknown in other parishes. So there is a trade-off here, so clearly democracy has a cost to it. There are savings to be had in a single election day in terms of efficiencies and economies of scale, if you like. So there will be costs to having a separate election day. I've estimated, and it's been suggested to me, that a realistic figure could be in the region of £20,000 when it comes to printing and postage, because that would need to be done separately, a separate booklet. But of course, the booklet would be thinner, and then the subsequent booklet for deputies and constables election would also only include those. So There might be a figure which is a small saving that can be made on the latter, but there would be a net cost to this. But I believe that the financial cost of this would be outweighed by the public interest in giving the focus to the senatorial elections, and there would also be some manpower implications about having to staff the polling stations potentially in that regard. But again, I think this proposal has merit that if we are to bring back senators, then I think we should go back to the position which was common for those decades preceding 2011 and actually give 2 separate periods where the focus can be on one and then the focus can be on the other election. So I make the proposition.
Thank you, Deputy. Is the amendment seconded?
Yes, sir.
Does any member wish to speak on the amendment? Contab of St Mary.
Yes, an administrative point, if I may. So could the Deputy kindly remind us of the actual timeline? It refers to the deadline being before the nominations for deputies are closed. Could you, and bearing in mind that the PERDA period would have to be extended to accommodate the additional time, could you remind us in practical terms how the timeline between the first election of senators and that of deputies?
That was a point of clarification. Do you prepare to clarify that aspect of your speech?
I mean, I'll clarify in the summing up, sir, if that's all right.
Yes. Do you want to make a speech now, Contab?
No, that's the only question.
All right. Yes, Chief Minister.
Thank you, sir. Briefly, sir, and I thank the Deputy for his short opening speech, which was comprehensive and covered some of the challenges around this. Just very quickly, by way of background, I want to remind members that the history behind the removal of the island-wide mandate is as follows, that on the 20th of January 2011, the Assembly voted to reduce the number of senators. I wasn't a member at that time, so I was having a sabbatical, as it were. There were 12 senators at the time, of which 6 were elected every 3 years. The Assembly voted to reduce the number of senators to be elected at the next elections later in that year of 2011 from 6 to 4, which made 10 senators. At that time, the Assembly also voted in favour of a further reduction from 10 to 8 senators for the elections in October 2014. So this was all done in a rather piecemeal way, without consultation or the permission, or even the knowledge in some instances of the electorate, who found out after the debates at the time. And the process that led to this package of reform was instigated by a state's decision in 2010 to introduce a single election day. Not long after, it was contended by some that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to elect the states as constituted then on one day. Well, we've actually proved that wrong, because we've had a number of single election days where the public have managed actually quite well to fill in 3 fairly straightforward forms. So I think that argument has just holds no strength at all for the argument to say our system was or could become too complicated. The point is, in relation to what Deputy Taddier is proposing in this amendment, is the election of 6 senators on a different election day was based around 6 senators being elected every 3 years. It was about that continuity in government, which might not be a bad idea, actually. I thought that worked relatively well. But the challenges I see with this amendment now, since we've bedded into the single election day, is that there could be some issues in relation to the election. For example, I mean, it gives members 2 bites of the cherry, doesn't it? You stand for senator, and if you fail, you go to the election, the deputy elections that follow up, and that could be fine. But candidates who do that benefit from additional exposure and the raising of profile, which some would say provides an advantage in the following deputies' elections, thus disadvantaging candidates that just come forward and stand in the deputies' elections. You could also say that existing states members enjoy better name recognition, but that's, as we see now, in standard elections. So Whilst I quite like the idea of reverting to 2 election days, I think it could be problematic, and you know, a lot of members, some were here at the time, some weren't. I wasn't in this, as I said at that time. Argued that a single election day is more democratic, and perhaps doing everything on one day, we hoped would get more people to the polls. But of course we've seen that it hasn't, and when we did remove the island-wide mandate at the last election, that had a detrimental effect on the turnout. So whilst I can see the attraction of this, I would urge members not to support it, stick to the election day as proposed by Deputy Miller. And if that is successful, this is something that perhaps could be considered by the next Assembly, should they decide to, sir. So I think we stick to a single election day. We elect our constables, our deputies and our senators for this Assembly all on one day. I think we have a far better chance of rebuilding public confidence in the election process if we do that, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Minister. Deputy Scott.
Thank you, sir. I hadn't really formed any position on this when Deputy Taddier brought this proposition, but I was really interested to hear his reasons for bringing it, and I thought he's given it. And the first thing I thought, and I thank the Chief Minister for his explanation, was why were things changed to a single election day. And I have found the original proposition, I believe it was brought by Deputy Lafondre, if I have the right one. And interesting enough, one of the things that he was suggesting that it says the PPC notes that different election days are one of the factors that cause lower turnouts. Well, I don't really know how well that went in terms of an ambition to increase turnout. And I'm also quite interested about the proposal even now about holding elections on Sundays. We live in hope, and I think there's a lot of reasons why our turnout is low to be investigated, including how we deliver as states members. But I do think that there was a kind of point, and I can refer to some personal experience in terms of why did I go, first of all, down the senator route rather than go the deputy route. Some people asked me, and the simple fact is that I wasn't actually thinking about having any ministerial position. I thought it would be nice if I could, and I could do one if I was offered it, but more that I wanted to represent people island-wide. And I know that sounds very glib, but just I was looking at the big issues and these things. I had done work in my own community, local campaigning, and thinking, let's try and do some work representing people island now. And even now, I found myself, hesitating about standing under this system, because I thought, well, now I'm also being asked to do the job of a constable, as I perceived it. But what happened then was that I had, I did have a deputy in my own district, or at least one candidate standing, and that was Deputy John Young. And in fact, I didn't know who else would stand or put their nomination forward, because they were all held on the same day. Oh, perhaps I can't quite remember. But what essentially turned out was I thought, well, I know, I'm not really going to object to him, so why don't I go for the senatorial seat? I don't particularly, feel like contesting him. I think he could do some good work. Whether in retrospect I feel he delivered on my expectations is another matter, but, I'm not going into those things. And so I stood for senator, and as people know, I didn't actually win a seat. So what Deputy Taddier is suggesting is that at that point, had something been introduced along the lines of what he's proposing, I could have said, right, okay, that's okay, but now I'll see if, the whole island doesn't want me. Let's see if my own community would want me. And I think in the context of what happened, he's right insofar it would have increased choice, because Deputy Young didn't have another candidate to stand against, a point that he felt was, he didn't particularly satisfy him. Of course, things have changed because the system has changed. But even so, I'm still kind of have my doubt. I'm still actually thinking, well, that period between standing for senator and standing for deputy is pretty key to this, because let's face it, campaigning for election is pretty tiring. And then what you're actually saying is, right, you stood for senator, why don't you have a go? It sounds really attractive, but then you're having to mount a different campaign, fund those costs, and at that point, do you really want to do that? Unless you've actually got quite a long period. And so I find myself almost coming into that thinking about, should we have 2 years between elections, a certain number of people in the States, just to retain corporate memory. But then, as some would say, the electorate does seem to have a habit, for one reason or another, of re-electing people who have been in the States Assembly before. So I'm pretty open to this, listening to more arguments, and perhaps the Deputy might give me some more reasoning to support his proposition in his summing up. But thank you for the contribution so far.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member speak on the amendment? Deputy Rob Ward.
Thank you, sir. I thought my thoughts on this are, there are a number of different points, I think, to this. First of all, one of the things we're talking about with senators is to look at the quality of candidate coming forward. And to have a high quality of candidates, you need a high quality field of candidates. Now, I asked members in this assembly who may be voting for senators whether they therefore would stand as senator, or whether they might feel that's a little risky and then won't stand. And then we'll end up with some, perhaps 8 good candidates and 22 not good candidates, and it doesn't become the best election in terms of choosing senators. However, if they're on different dates, it may have more people who will say, you know what, I'll give a senatorial election a go, and I can test myself, test my manifesto away from just my constituency to see how I can perform, to see whether that is the right role for me, whether I can get an island-wide mandate, and really participate fully. And in that way, I think that's the way in which we're going to get a much stronger field and a much stronger election. In terms of turnout, we have to do a lot of other things in terms of turnout. Voter registration, the day of the voting, these ease in which people vote, young people, getting young people voting. We're very, very progressive. I'm the first person to say in this entire debate, I think, we can vote at 16 here. And it's the first time we've mentioned this, about young people being able to vote. And I think there's an irony that that's the first time we've mentioned it, after all the words that have been spoken in the last few days. Now, that's the future of voting. To say to those voters, if you want to bring back senators, look, there will be 2 really important days in the electoral cycle. The first one is for senator, which is an island-wide mandate. And you will listen to people, and people will put themselves forward to say why they see that's important, what they want to bring forward. If there are political parties, those parties would have to really convince a lot of the electorate on that day that they are the right message that's going across. And that message will be tested island-wide. There are some other points that are useful. If you stand as an island-wide candidate, you get your vote broken up into the different districts. If you look at your own districts and perform incredibly strongly in your own district, you might think, actually, you know, I've got support there and I can do a job for that district. Because, to be quite frank, I really enjoy being a local deputy in a district. People say hello to you all the time. When you go to Springfield and watch the wonderful Jersey Bulls who are going to win the league, then you know, a lot of people come and chat with you and say, and when someone says to me, you're my deputy, it is a very significant and important thing. So you do have that link. Now, also, there will be, and we've been through this so many times. If you look at the report to the main proposition, it talks about how many votes people have and top the poll. So we're talking about that. So there will be a significant pressure for those who are senators, if we decide to go down that route, to be ministers and take on whole island roles. Otherwise, why on earth would you have a whole island vote? I don't quite understand why you'd have those two things. Now, if that's the case, then you've got to have people who are willing to step up. Now, you could end up with a situation where you have 18 really strong candidates and there are 50 votes between the last 10. So you've got people who really could all have been elected into those posts and be very strong states members who understand the work, have come from a background, a diverse background of wherever, from whatever industry or whatever background skills they have, whatever education they have. But then you will lose 10 of those candidates if they're on the same day, and you'll have others going for deputy who perhaps don't have those skills. And then we constantly go on about the quality of states member. This is an opportunity to get high quality candidates to have that, if you like, second chance if they want it. Because there is another side to this coin. You might stand for a senatorial post and think, I want nothing to do with this. I don't like being in the limelight. I don't like the fact that everybody wants to know the ins and outs of everything I do. And I've looked at what the States Assembly do, and I've changed my mind. The worst thing you want to do is make that decision on your first day sat in this Assembly. That's a disastrous idea. And so there are real opportunities here to increase the quality of our candidature, to give opportunities for people to stand or make the decision not to stand. And I think if somebody in a senatorial campaign convinces a group in the island or a constituency or most of the island that they are a good, strong candidate, to just leave that on the day and say, it's all or nothing, I'm afraid, is not a successful approach for us to get quality candidates. I would ask members of this Assembly, will you stand as a constable? Because if you're not going to stand as a constable, vote for it. Why not? Why not? Okay? Because if you want the whole island vote, perhaps you should be part of that. You should be ambitious enough to say, I want to do that. And one of the reasons will be it's so high risk. But if you say, well, actually I would, and I'd give it a really good go, if I recognise that I could still perhaps, if I'm successful, because you might not be, serve as a deputy. Because actually losing one vote may not do you any good in the second round as a deputy. I don't know. I don't know if there are any statistics on that. So I would urge members to think very, very carefully about this and think about, do we want to increase the quality of fields and give people an opportunity who could be really good states members from wherever hue of the political spectrum they come from, and that bringing the quality of this Assembly of there. Also, for those members who have been here for one term and might think, actually, I would want to step across, I'm not going to say up, I'm going to say across, into that post. It might stop you because of the high risk, because you enjoy the job that you're doing. So let's create those opportunities. Let's create the importance of that for people on the island to vote. Senatorial votes are really important. Deputy votes are really important. The constable votes are really important. That's the argument we've got to win. And if we say to people, it's so important, we're going to have separate elections, so you get more than one chance to choose these people and really scrutinise what they're saying to you. You won't get one booklet through the door with 500 pages. You'll get a shorter booklet from one door, you'll get a shorter booklet for that one, and it will give you time and the opportunity to see. Plus, and there was a really important point, I don't want to go on for too long, sorry, I do think very carefully about this. I think the point about who is elected as senator and then to the deputy role is actually quite important, because they're going to have to work together. And some of those senatorial candidates might want to say, look, this is really important, I think we can work on this in this way. So I think this is a much better way forward. Yes, it will mean initially a change, and we'll have to do something about the timings, but you have to do that whenever you make a change. We're going to have to make a change whatever decision is made, or not make a change, depending on how we go. But if we're going to make a step to bring back the third type of states member, I really believe it should be on separate days to give as many opportunities as people as possible to come and represent in this Assembly. If we do that, every single one of us can say, people have had the chance, we've stepped up, we've taken that opportunity, now we've got a mandate in what we're doing. And that's the real key to this. So I urge members to support this amendment. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member speak on this amendment? Conatable of St Bernard.
Thank you, sir. I referred in a previous debate to the Mori poll of 2006, and I just want to pull another bit out of that, if I may. So, Chart 21, Attitudes Towards General Election. And the question was, states members are elected at various times for varying terms of office, which was the case before that. Do you think that separate elections should be continue to take place for different types of members on different dates? 24% responded to that. Don't know opinion, of which there are always some, 5% responded to that. And the question that there should be a general election for all states members on the same day had a response of 71%. Sarah, I rest my case based on that.
Thank you, Kaitab. Does any other member speak on this amendment? Deputy Mezek.
Thank you, sir. Interesting hearing that result from the Mori poll. Of course, there was also a poll in 2013 which had 80% of those voting against having senators in the Assembly. So I'm presuming that the Council of St Brelard will be taking that into account later on in this debate. But so that there is a great inconsistency in the perceptions that are put forward about the distinctions between the roles of senator and deputy. The fact of the matter in law and standing orders is that when deputies and senators coexisted in this assembly, there was absolutely no difference in the roles whatsoever. They were both members of the State's Assembly with the same rights, the same responsibilities, the same powers, the same ability to serve in positions, the same salary, the same everything. The roles were legally and through standing orders absolutely identical. The only difference was the intangible difference of perception, that they were just kind of seen as more senior to the deputies because the election process they had been through was that of an island-wide election rather than in a district. And having been elected in both capacities, I can testify that the process of those elections are very different. But now we talk about reintroducing senators into our electoral system without specifying that there would be a legal distinction between the two roles. They would, if reinstated, go back to that old system where in law and in standing orders they were absolutely the same, which begs the question, what's the point if the job is identical? But if you are to hinge it on the argument, and it's the only argument they have, which is that there's a perception that they are more senior because they've been through an island-wide election, then surely the way of electing them should recognise that that is the point where you provide that distinction between the roles. And so having them elected on the same day prevents the public from having a focused election on those island-wide seats to focus on them in the way they want, consider all the issues, determine how to vote, at the same time, on the same day, as doing the same for your deputies' districts and your parish constable. You can end up with the, I would say, disadvantage for the Assembly and for the public of forcing candidates or prospective candidates to calculate best where they think their best chance is and go for that rather than just put your name forward because it's what you want to do and not have to worry about those considerations and whether you're finding the right constituency or what have you. So in a senatorial election held on the same day as that of deputies, you can have some perfectly decent, good candidates who just miss out and have just missed out, not because they've faced a big rejection from the public, but because some might have said, yeah, you're pretty good, I just like the other ones a little bit better, maybe your time will come sometime else, or maybe, as some islanders consider it, would like to see what they're capable of as a deputy before giving them a senatorial role, where that comes with a perception that they may be more likely to get more senior roles when the government is constituted. So you can miss out on perfectly decent and talented candidates without the ability to then run for deputy and do that kind of apprenticeship. That's the word I've heard some people describe it as. And reduce the pool of good candidates for the deputies contests, because some of them will have gone for senator and have done really, really well, but not well enough, meaning that in the deputy election, it's not as hotly contested. So in 2011, at that time I was a resident of St Saviour No. 2 district, and I remember being very disappointed in that election at the time, because I knew that I was casting senatorial votes, but I knew that I also had 2 votes to cast in the deputies district, and there was nowhere near as much coverage of that local election as there was the senators one, to actually find out what my local deputy candidates were standing for, what positions they were taking, what different characteristics each candidate had. It was much harder to come by, because every time I picked up a paper, all it was doing was talking about the senatorial contest and the hustings that had happened before. So I think I was denied decent coverage and a decent ability to inform myself. That being said, so I did still make the right decision and vote for the then Deputy Lewis in that election. He'll be delighted to know. I had enough to at least get my judgment right on that. But so that, I think, that ends up denigrating the other members of the Assembly, the deputies in particular, because you're not having a focused election on those. They are going to be sidelined and put second in the coverage and focus to the senators, because that will be considered more exciting. It will be seen as where the real contest for the senior government positions will be, even though the deputies, once elected, will massively outnumber all of the senators and, in fact, the constables put together too, and that will be where the voting power will be to determine who does get the senior roles. So it really doesn't make sense to have them elected on the same day if the job constitutionally is the same, but the difference is in perception, and it's seen as the territory where the real contest happens for chief ministerial position. To separate them out gives us an opportunity to have focused elections on each of those categories without them being distracted, and giving each election the widest possible pool of good candidates, because people know you can run for senator, offer yourself to the public so they can choose whether they want you for not in that particular role and in that contest for what will be one of the more senior positions. And if it doesn't quite work out, you've got the option then of going for deputy, where your district can say, okay, we weren't ready for you as senator, but happy for deputy, where you're probably less likely to end up in a much more senior role, and you see where you can go from there. Where you could end up, if they're elected all on the same day, with all of the good candidates for senior positions running for senator, not getting all of them elected, and then having to fill in other government positions from the deputies' benches where there hasn't been the kind of scrutiny in their election campaigns that there ought to be. A few other points to make, sir, that it's actually really normal to have multi-rounds of voting. In France, I think most of their elections are done on a multi-round system, where you'll have your first round of voting, and if no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, you come back an entire month later to vote for them. You don't even do it on one ballot paper with ranked voting. They do that not just for presidential, but for parliamentary elections as well. I know lots of countries in South America or Latin America have multi-rounds voting, certainly in their presidential systems, possibly in the parliamentary ones too. So it's actually perfectly normal. And so for all of the talk we had yesterday about Jersey culture, our history and heritage, is that the 2-round system is actually what we had for 60 years. One that I think you can make a good case for, that worked properly. The general election, all being elected on one day, works much better if you don't have a 3-tier system, if you just have a 1-tier system. But if it's a multi-tier system, staging them gives gives voters the best opportunity to properly scrutinise their candidates and have the best pool of candidates to choose for. So it's perfectly within our history and our culture to do it this way. Lots of people feel very fondly about that. And I think it's worth saying, sir, that when these public meetings happened on P2, and they weren't very well attended, but of people that did attend, they, even if they counted themselves among those who were supportive of the principle of reinstating some form of island-wide voting, the way in which that is done, they were completely divided over. There was certainly no overwhelming consensus that the model proposed in P2 is the perfect model, the right one for Jersey. We simply can't do any better than this. When you spoke to people at those meetings and said, okay, but what do you really want? There was a great variety of different points of view, including those who were very clear that we liked the system as it was pre-2011, where we could have our senatorial election, vote on that, and then a month later we come back to considering the deputies' election. So the final point I'll make, just to, poke fun slightly at the Chief Minister, who is obviously not in the room, but he, in these debates, has certainly been consistent for the last 14 years, in that he has always lamented the changes that were made in 2011. He made that a manifesto point when he ran for election in 2011, and in his speeches in the Assembly since then, he's always said that the decisions made in 2011 to bring all the elections together and cut the number of senators was one that he thought was wrong. But what I didn't know, that he's only just reminded me, is that the decision to implement those changes in the 2011 election were actually agreed and finalised just a few months before that election, less than a year before that would come into force. And so, he's shown how much he lamented those changes, and the conduct in which those changes were put forward is not too dissimilar from the way that P2 is being proceeded with. So I hope that will give him cause for reflection on that. It won't, but maybe, we can live in hope anyway. And so I think the option proposed by Deputy Tadjer allows voters the best of both worlds: a good, well-contested senatorial election where the debate can focus on island-wide issues and who's going to hold the most senior roles in government, and then a month or so later, election for your local deputies where there's no distraction by the senatorial result, where you can have equally contestable elections there that voters can hold their candidates to account properly, which is simply not possible when it's all done on the same day. And if the members' jobs are ultimately to be the same, it really doesn't make sense to divide them up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Miller.
Thank you, sir. I don't support this amendment, which is why I didn't accept it earlier on. The two-stage voting hasn't happened since 2011, so it's a big change to go back to something that hasn't happened since then, in terms of both law drafting and the administration of running elections. There will be extra complexity of drafting and of cost. It will create more work for the parishes, the polling stations, the judicial greffe, and I think Deputy Tadjer's cost estimate is probably light. I do agree, however, that with him and Deputy Mezek, that several people brought this up at the meetings. Some people of older years who have been used to the concept of senator did say, why don't we go back to the two-stage voting? Why don't we go back to the system where senators have a 6-year term? Why don't we go back to the system where senators, we have a rolling period of elections with some people retiring every 3 years? Obviously I didn't live through that. I always found the split voting slightly odd, because it does give a failed candidate, and that's what we remember, somebody who fails in one election to stand again. I also don't understand how it would work with our current system of ministerial government. What happens? We elect some senators and they sit around and just campaign for a few weeks while we elect the rest of the assembly? Or do they come in, take the ministerial job straight away, and then when it comes to the election, they say, well, we've been doing the job for 3 weeks, we should get to keep it. I just don't see how it works practically. But what I said in all of the meetings when these things came up is that my proposition is simply about returning the island-wide mandate, which is what I believe the public are most interested in. They would forego any of those other demands just to have the island-wide mandate back. We have also talked about whether a senator, I've also been clear that a senator is not guaranteed a ministerial role. I've also been clear that a senator did not have to have been a deputy or a constable first, because we have to make room for the really exceptional candidate or the candidate who is well known to the public. People make their own decisions. So, for example, Senator Ian Lamarckond, I believe when he retired as magistrate, he stood as a senator, and I believe he came in with a landslide majority, is my recollection. I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that Senator Lamarckond had a hugely successful result because he was a hugely well-known candidate with a high profile who was highly respected. And we have to make room for people like that to come into the Assembly right away. I'm not putting myself in that category, but you could have somebody towards the end of one career who want to come into politics and simply don't have the time left in them to do several terms before they can stand as an island-wide candidate. There is, however, I do believe there is a public perception and of someone who is elected with the island-wide mandate. Elections are, by their very nature, a risky business. We have probably all looked at the outcomes of elections all around the world, not just in Jersey, and been astonished at the winners and the losers. In St John, St Lawrence and Trinity, in the last election, myself and 3 other newcomers stood against a former chief minister, a minister and an assistant minister, and a sitting deputy. And only the assistant minister, Deputy Morell, was returned. And the Trinity voted for 3, not only did Trinity vote for 3 newcomers, they voted for 3 women, which was something someone told me Trinity and the district was unlikely to do. We all take our chances. I gave up a very good job to stand for election, and I decided I would do that and take my chances, and if I wasn't elected, I would find a plan B. I didn't have plan B in mind at the time, but we all make a risk. The notion that whether you stand for a senator or a deputy or a constable, any of us is a shoo-in, is unlikely. And what works in other jurisdictions, as we've already said, France, Portugal, wherever, they are all very much larger jurisdictions with systems that have evolved over many, many years, as has our own. Lastly, sir, I'd just like to say that I have been in Ajwa in a polling station. I think it was at Saviour number 3. It must have been 2018. I'm afraid I can't remember. I think Deputy Perchard may have been the winner in that particular election. But I have no recollection of seeing, of the 3 ballot papers that were cast, I have no recollection of vast numbers of small papers. People understood what they were doing and they voted accordingly. There is not, I don't believe, giving someone 3 voting papers and saying, choose 1 from this list of names, 2 or 3 from that list of names, and 9 from this list of names. It is not a difficult concept. And I think where we are in terms of ministerial government, I think this is simply too much of a retrograde step, and I would ask members to reject it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member to speak on this amendment? I call upon Deputy Stadio. Deputy Ozer, do you want to speak on this amendment?
Yes, please, sir. Sorry, thank you for calling me, sir. I think that there is great merit in having a 2-stage election. They worked previously, and there was, I don't think, looking back at the records, there was a diminution in the voter turnout. And in other jurisdictions, sir, where you have a history of 2 elections. I note with interest that you have a runoff election in France for the presidential election, where you don't get the president elected unless they get a full, a proper majority of the electorate. And I mean, it's one of these amendments, so it's limiting the damage, really. If we're going to be unwise in rushing something, then at least we should have a mature debate. I will be supporting PPC's move for a 2030 election of senators if we decide to do that. That seems to be very sensible. And I think that it's got great merit on the basis of a 2030 election that if we were going to have senators, to have a 2-rounder. But I would like also to debate with the public whether or not they want senators first or second. Because there is an argument, and I can see the move of the proposition nodding his head, to say that actually a senatorial should be a runoff. Because what's happened with previous senatorial elections, sir, that have been first, is you've had effectively a trial run for deputy, and then those that have not succeeded in the senatorial election, and then we've been round on a parish roadshow after it was the late Senator de Carteret told all the senatorial candidates that he was going to turn up at all the parish halls, and then we had senators for the first time having to go. Goodness me, they said, I'm told at the time, they had to turn up to all the parish halls for a hustings. And it was Senator de Carteret, the late Senator de Carteret, who introduced that system. And when he said he was going to turn up at the hustings, they all did. And so there was even a hustings at St Mary's, for the Constable of St Mary's, an equal one. And so basically, I think that there should be consideration, and it's said in all seriousness, there was merit. I was talking to...
clarification, or do you want to speak?
Yes, please, sir.
Oh, so, yes, of course.
I think I know for a fact that it wasn't John de Carteret. It was my father in 1969, he said. And he came in as a completely newcomer and topped the poll.
I do take that back, and I understand. Well, I was asked to do the eulogy for the late Carteret, and that information was given to me by somebody who I thought knew, but I take that back. But certainly, it was until 1969 there was no island-wide hustings. And one has to question whether or not hustings were actually a test of public opinion and policy, sir. I don't really think they were. I think there's a lot that needs to be thought about in relation to the way we elect senators, if we do. It didn't really work. It was largely a popular context of knowing your name. And if we're going to do it, I'm in favour of a dual vote and a 2-stage process. The single election day made it very complicated for all of these things. The population has got to assimilate candidates for senator, if we go down this road, candidates for deputy, and a constable. How many names are they going to have to recognise on their piece of paper when they go into the voting booths? It's completely crazy. People may shake their heads, sir, but that's the reality of it. People only use 4.5 votes when there were 6 senators. So it's got to be legitimate. And so a 2-stage check, if you're going to do it, it's got to be done, but I think it might be the other way around. But as it's just an agreement in principle, I'm going to vote in favour of this particular amendment because it's lessening the damage. It should only come in after mature consideration and a proper process, not just rushed through.
Thank you, Deputy. If no other members... Yes, Deputy Balash.
So I'd just like to add a brief postscript to the speech of Deputy Miller, because I think it's worth recalling why the Assembly moved to a single election day. And I think it's generally accepted that the reason for that break with 60 years of history was the position of a particular president of the Finance and Economics Committee who had been responsible in part for the introduction of the goods and services tax. It was not a popular move in some quarters, even though it was absolutely the right thing to do. But it was not very popular.
But the president of the Finance and Economics Committee of the day was a senator who was halfway through his 6-year term. And he found himself continuing in office as a member of the States, even though many members of the populace would have wished to wreak their vengeance upon him. And subsequently, indeed, he became the chief minister to add salt to the wound. That was why we moved to a single election day. And I do think there is a case for retaining that practice, because the public must be allowed to punish members of the states who have sinned or are thought to have sinned in some way politically. And it would not be a good thing for a candidate who had failed to become a senator to have the opportunity to come in later on as a deputy, despite all the reasons why it might be thought to be a good idea, as articulated by Deputy Tadier.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment?
Thank you, sir. Just very briefly, sir. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to vote on this one, but I will give it careful consideration during the summing up. I would like to just point out just a few things that do irritate me. It's probably something to do with old age, so I get irritated easily. It's not an easy thing to do to stand for election if one is not experienced in public speaking and meeting members of the public. So I like to think that if somebody does not get elected, they're not a failed candidate, they are unsuccessful. Because it's very depressing for people when they do not get elected. And if they have something to offer, I do hope they will stand again. And another thing I've heard recently, which does also annoy me, the people of Jersey do not need to be educated. The people of Jersey need to be informed about certain things that are happening in the Assembly. I say I haven't made my mind up which way I'm going to vote. I will listen to the summing up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Conor. No other member wishes to speak. I call upon Deputy Tadier to reply. Yes.
So I'm so glad to have that last speaker, because it gives me something to sum up to, and gives me a challenge, and gives me some optimism at least. Because I think, if I'm right, I remember the election in which Deputy Lewis first got elected, as he was at the time. It was 2005, and it's the first election I voted in, actually. I came back to the island after studying and being away, and that's, when I was probably 25, took some interest in politics, and I made a decision to vote only in the senatorial elections for only party members, and I think it was the Centre Party and the JDA at the time. I shouldn't probably admit to voting for the Centre Party, but I don't think I was a member at the time necessarily of the JDA. But so I know that Deputy Lewis has got experience of running for senator as well, and being a deputy and now being a constable. Let me start with the point. Deputy Balash is correct when he says that it was important, and one of the motivations of some of the changes that came through was about punishing the current government. I don't necessarily like to use those words, but it's actually about regime change, if we can put it that way. To use another unfortunate expression, is that if a government has been performing badly, it's important that you can kick them out. As happened at the last election, in fact, the previous government chose a bizarre time to form a party because they put a metaphorical bullseye on their backs, shall we say, if not heads. So the electorate were able to say, yep, okay, thanks for telling us, and which is why I think in St Helier North, when Deputy Gardner was knocking on doors, they said, are you a member of a party? Because we don't want to vote for you. Of course they didn't want to vote for you. There were no reform candidates. They didn't want to vote for parties because there was no reform candidates there. So of course they had to vote for independence. I empathise with their pain in that choice. So, but the point about punishing the government is not to do with a single election day. It's actually to do with all members being elected at the same election cycle. And so it was actually the legacy seats of the senators which were removed. Because what you had previously were 6 senators who remained in government and didn't have to face an election at the same time when all of the other, I think, 53 members, so 47 members were facing an election. 6 got a free pass to the next election, and they would invariably go on to take the top jobs, even though they were often deeply unpopular. They pushed through, some would argue, necessary, but I would argue also highly divisive and certainly contentious policies, which saw them get a free pass. And that didn't go down well with the public. And that's why not a single election day per se, but a single election cycle is the most important point here. So let's not get fixated on the fact about the timing of the elections. The point is here, the public is still electing a whole assembly of 49 members in the same election cycle, who will all take their seats at the same time in this assembly. What we're simply talking about here now is whether or not the elections should be staggered. Okay, so we're not talking about, so the ability to cast a verdict both on previous governments and previous members who may not have been in government still remains the case. And it will still remain the case, even with what's being slightly derogatorily called the 2 bites of the cherry. So even if a person doesn't get in as senator, they run for constable, they run for deputy, the public still ultimately have the choice in their district. If they want them, they elect them. If they don't want them, they don't get elected. That's democracy. Now, when I heard the arguments from Deputy Miller, and frankly, I'm surprised that, again, I'm not having this proposition, this amendment, I'm not having my hand being bitten off, because actually I think that this adds value to the role of senator. It makes it more likely, I think, to get through. It makes it more workable from the point of view of the public, who I've emphasised will be able to focus on one election at a time. And of course, it's been mentioned that in other places it's usual to have different rounds of election. Part of that is due to a different voting system, but the key point here is that the presidential election in a lot of countries, well, most countries will have a presidential election, i.e. you elect the executive, and then you have the legislative and local elections. So even though we don't have a presidential system in Jersey, it's been accepted, I think, that the public will expect the chief minister to come from the pool of senators, even if other ministerial positions don't come from that pool. As I've said before, and I think there's general agreement in here, it would be unconscionable, I think, if in the future we had 9 senators elected to this assembly, 2 of those senators stood for chief minister, 1 deputy stood for chief minister, and the deputy got elected. I don't think it would even be acceptable conventionally, if not understanding orders. This assembly wouldn't sign the nomination paper of a deputy or a constable who wanted to put themselves forward in the face of other potentially capable senators, even if that deputy or constable was well placed to be popular in the assembly. I don't see that washing either with the assembly and certainly not with the public. Therefore, it is, and it was the case. So Deputy Miller talked about returning to how it was in the past, but actually she would like to return to how it was for 10 years. Actually, the separate election days were normal for over 60 years, and it served the island well. And what I would say is that actually, when they moved to a single election day, that was, I believe, and some believe that it was the first step on a journey to actually changing the wider electoral system by stealth. It was evolution, not revolution, and whether it was an unintended consequence or whether it was by design, I'm not entirely sure. But the inevitability of going to a single election day with 3 members is, as I said in the opening speech, sir, is that the public and other members scratch their head and say, well, what's the point in having 3 types of member if we're all the same and the elections are all going to be on the same day, and where do I concentrate my attention? Forget about space on the ballot paper, as Deputy Ozef said. What about space on the lampposts? You know, we haven't talked about that, but it is a consideration. There's limited space when you're contesting a constable's election in St Mary. You've got a deputy's election for another,
Sir,
it will be 3 seats.
Point of order, sir. St Mary has no lampposts.
Here we are.
Hence why it's called the Dark Parish. I know now. I thought that was a political description, but it's a physical one. So let's choose another parish. Any constables, can you help me here? Do we have lampposts in any other parishes? Or, so when the signs are being put up, you know, there is going to be a fight for those spaces, and which ones go up first. It used to be the case that the senators' posters would go up, and the banners, no doubt, and then once the election was over, they'd come down, and then the local elections could take place, and there would be good focus on the local elections, people knowing who the senators were. And what would the senators do in the meantime? Would they just sit on their hands? I suspect they wouldn't. I think they would get to work. I think they would, the ones who have been states members before would probably start drafting policies. They would look to see which other senators they might work from. They would try and find out who the chief minister was going to be. Those who were newly elected to the states, because it does happen, it's an exception rather than the rule, may want to actually start their inductions early with the Gref, therefore having a staggered process. Now we talk about ourselves a lot, don't we? And we have been in the last point. But let's maybe take an example about what one would do in the world of business recruitment, because we're not, we might need to look at that. And I'm looking partly at Deputy Scott when I do this, but perhaps some of the other members in the Assembly who have business experience. So let's imagine we're not states members, but we're the head of a business. For some of us, it's not hypothetical. And you need 3 posts to recruit for. You need a head of quality control, you need a head of HR, and you need a head of marketing. Now, would we say that you can only apply for one of those positions, and that if you don't get one of those positions, you're automatically excluded from the other roles? Because that's what we do. That's what we're going to be doing for whether it's the next election or the one in 2030, depending when senators come back. You might find that you've got a great slate of candidates who apply for the marketing job. And actually, you realise that you take the best one, of course, for the job, and you've got a marketeer, and then you say, actually, that person who almost got through to the second round, they would be really great as my HR manager, but I've got a policy in my firm which says that they can only apply for one position at a time. Because after all, I don't want to have losers working in my firm. I don't want to have failed applicants working in my HR department. Therefore, I'm going to start a completely new round of election at a different time. Not election, a new round of recruitment, which is completely separate. Of course, you wouldn't do that. It would be complete madness. It may be that actually, in recruiting for your marketing manager, you find that you've already found your quality control and HR person, because you're the one who knows best who might fit into those particular roles and what you need to do. We don't do that in our system. It's completely mad. And that's all to do with the fact that we insist on 3 different roles which have 3 slightly different requirements in terms of the electorate, even though we all end up the same. I say we, whoever ends up here in the future, even though they have the same role, the roles that we do outside of this assembly all are different, and therefore I would suggest need a different application process. I'm fully happy to be transparent with the costs. The costs are listed there, but there is a trade-off here about democracy. Democracy costs, and it's actually bringing back the senators, which costs money. So when I heard the mover of the original proposition saying, you know, this would make it too complicated, it would be costly, it's actually that's a cost to bringing back the senators in the first place. There will have to be another round of election, irrespective of whether it's on the same day or irrespective of whether it's on 6 weeks later. So those are all the comments I wish to make at this point, apart from to answer the question of the Constable of St Mary, who asked about the logistics of this. Ultimately, it will be a matter that PPC will need to come back with, whether it's done for this next election or the one in 2030. The point I would make is this happened routinely between 1948 and 2011. So it's been done before, and both the Gref, the Assembly, the judicial Gref as well, and the parish has managed to cope with it for over 60 years. I don't think they would have a problem with doing it again, and there is the ability for us to change slightly the length of our officers by a few weeks to shorten or lengthen them to fit in 2 rounds of elections, sir. I believe that the merits of this election day outweigh any costs, financial costs that might be implemented, any workload, because it actually provides for a better system of election, a more nuanced approach, and better scrutiny of the elections themselves. So I do maintain the proposition, sir, and ask for the appel.
The appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. Ask the greffier. Ask the greffier to open the voting. All members have the opportunity of casting their votes. I ask the greffier to close the vote. Announce the amendment has been narrowly defeated. 22 votes pour, 24 votes contre.
So may I just check, is that also subject to, if it would have been, it's counterfactual, but would it have only passed if it would have had 25 votes?
That's correct as well.
Thank you.
22 votes pour and 24 votes contre.
Can we have the count, please, sir?
Yes.
Those voting pour, the Conotab of St Helier, Deputies Southern, Tadier, Morale, Ward, Alves, Gardner, Mesick, Ozef, Coles, Porre, War, Miles, Scott, Curtis, Feltham, Binet, Howell, Binet, Kovac, Curtis and Andrews. Those voting contre, the Conotabs of St Lawrence, St Brelard, Trinity, St Peter, St Martin and St John and Grouville, St Mary and St Saviour, and Deputies Labby, Luce, Lahegara, Ayer, Gorst, Farnham, Moore, Balash, Miller, Ferry, Ward and Wilson, and online the Conotab of St Clement and St Juan, and Deputy Stevenson.
The third and last amendment to be debated.
So could I actually propose the adjournment, sir? With just 10 minutes to go, it seems strange time to start the next debate.
Is that seconded? Are members content to adjourn now?
So before we do, can I just ask, so we can prepare for the morning, I've got a statement to make. Would members like me to make it first thing or after the amendments have been... I'd be happy to do it after this is concluded, if that's okay.
Do members wish the statement to be made after the conclusion of this debate?
As we are coming in the morning, sir, it might be good for the Francophonie president to make his statement first, and then we can go to business. I would have thought it's right to do it first in the day, and I hope he's going to do it in French, sir.
Yeah, well, I'll be ready to do it either way, so if members would want me to do it at 9:30, I can do that.
Is the wish of members to do that at 9:30? The statement at 9:30, and then we resume the debate. That's what we'll do. Assembly is adjourned until 9:30 tomorrow.